250. Chapter 250. Despite how it seemed it had actually taken several hours for Helena to modify the two ritual from before so it was right at 7 in the morning at the moment. With this in mind, Nick figured it would be fine to go eat. There were a few people in the halls who had either chosen to skip breakfast or were heading there themselves. No one seemed to notice that Helena wasn't floating next to Nick, but rather walking instead. They also didn't seem to notice how she couldn't be seen through like most ghosts. This changed, however, when they arrived in the great hall, and Helena sat down at the Ravenclaw table before casually filling a plate and digging in. It only took a few moments for the first student to realize exactly what was wrong with that scene. From there, it rapidly spread through the whole hall as almost everybody was staring at Helena feasting. Her table manners were impeccable, so she didn't make a mess despite it being clear she was eating nearly as much as Nick. Dumbledore had a serious expression from the professor's table, as he had also clearly noticed the wand Helena had. The other professors were also aghast at the spectacle, as for all intents and purposes, it seemed as though Helena Ravenclaw had been resurrected. Colin Creevey, the first year with the Muggle camera, wasted no time at all snapping a photo of this clearly significant event. Nick ignored all this as he, Dusk, and Steve ate, though he did notice how Ginny seemed to have an odd look. According to his magical senses, however, it wasn't her who was making that face, but rather the parasitical diary in her robes. Clearly Riddle had never imagined in his wildest dreams that the ghost of Ravenclaw would be resurrected. If the look of dread on Ginny's face was anything to go by then, the soul shard had likely already figured out that the secret of his immortality was probably not so secret anymore. The following look of cold determination, however, tempted Nick sorely to skip out on the basilisk and directly snatch the Horcrux from the girl, but he stopped himself. He's probably just made up his mind to push the timeline for the first attack forward is all, he thought while calming himself. After done eating Nick, and his two animal companions left the hall without anyone save Dumbledore the wiser. Nick went back to the workshop to hammer out his new layer of occlumency shields while the news spread like wildfire through the castle, and even outside of it, as students sent owls to their parents and siblings. Nick couldn't care less about this as he sat cross-legged in the workshop with his eyes closed. In his mindscape, he was arguing with Celebrimber over the next set of shields he set up. How is that better than my endless swarm of birds? Nick asked, irritated, as the stubborn elf insisted he use something of his people as a defense. The twin trees of Valinor were the greatest trees of all time to our people, and whose final fruits alone became our sun and moon. Nothing could be greater to protect your mind, Celebrimber insisted. They got destroyed, though. If I used such a thing as a defensive measure, it would expose a fatal flaw into my defenses. Nick shouted to try and drive this fact into the stubborn elf's mind. It would be worth it to constantly bathe in the two trees' light, Celebrimber insisted. If it was the real thing, sure, but it is just a fake, a fraud, and I refuse, Nick said angrily. They went back and forth like this for hours in the mindscape, but nothing got done. Nick had tried to change the stubborn elf's opinion, but failed to, and as such decided to ignore him. As grateful as he may have been to Celebrimber, he wasn't going to create such a blunder in his occlumency shields just to satisfy him. The best he was willing to do was create a replica of the two trees without any real substance to them. So with a bit of a mental flex, he spawned into existence two absolutely massive trees within the mindscape. One glowed with a brilliant, warm golden light, while the other glowed with a pale silver light that felt protective and wise. They were so large that they seemed to blend into the stars above and had trunks and roots the size of countries. Celebrimber smirked when they popped up, making it clear that Nick had been played like a fiddle by the old elf from the beginning of the argument. 251. Chapter 251. Nick merely sighed at this, since Celebrimber merely needed to ask if this was all he wanted rather than try and make a big fuss about it. Choosing to ignore the smug-looking elf, Nick turned his attention to the outer part of his mindscape, just behind his first set of defenses, and slowly began to manifest one bird after another. This was an incredibly time-consuming process, as he needed to program these birds to fly around the area infinitely, with the goal of stopping anything from getting through them. He went so far as to make each and every member of a particular species extremely detailed, including nature flight and hunting behaviors. He then created billions of each of these things before having them scatter and join the other species he was creating. In the end, he was left with a mini ecosystem of just birds that had the smaller ones getting hunted by the bigger ones. He then set a reproduction mechanism that caused each bird to split into two birds every day. This meant that the longer the second layer was active, the more and more dangerous to outsiders it would become. With that done, Nick finally left his mindscape, only to twitch his face a bit, as there was 3 ghosts in his workshop that had not been invited. A obese man in monk robes, Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, and the Bloody Baron. Obviously, these were the only ghosts that regularly haunted Hogwarts, and each represented a single house each. They were all arguing with each other about who should get the next ring Nick made to give ghosts a corporeal body. Nick knew that, while in his mindscape, he was disconnected from reality and vulnerable, but it seems like he needed to set up a ward against ghosts now. The 3 ghosts clearly noticed that Nick had opened his eyes, but the Fat Friar and Bloody Baron ignored him to continue arguing. Nearly headless Nick, however, immediately dropped out of the argument to speak with him. "Nick, my boy, why have you never mentioned that you were working on resurrecting ghosts?" he asked with an offended look. Nick chuckled. It never came up in conversation. Besides, she hasn't been resurrected, but merely placed in a state close to it, like poltergeist in a way. He explained honestly. "Is that so? I won't argue with you on this, as you clearly outmatch myself in this department, but surely you must understand how one would assume she had been resurrected." The kind ghost said seriously. Nick nodded. "I am aware of this, but fact remains that she has not. But enough about that. What's this whole argument about who is getting the next ring? Last I checked, that choice belongs solely in my hands, with the exception of you specifically." Nick said, pointing at the Bloody Baron, who looked confused. "You won't deny me this chance because of what I did before I died, are you?" the bloody ghost asked with a worried expression. Nick shook his head. "You didn't hear me, apparently. I said that the choice was my except in your case. For you, the one you have to convince is not me, but her," Nick said, pointing at Helena, who was painting off to the side. The Bloody Baron looked mortified by the idea and looked at Nick beggingly, but he got a cold glare in return. The ghost looked at Helena conflicted before floating over to her to try and make his case. Revenge is hers after 1,000 years, it seems. I will not mock him for the irony of the situation, but his chances are truly dreadful," the Fat Friar said with a sigh. "Now that that's taken care of, back to the matter at hand. I take it Helena has briefed you both on exactly what getting one of these rings from me means?" Nick asked seriously, and both ghosts nodded with stern expressions. "Do know that the rings will stop working and fall off of you should any sort of betrayal towards me happen. That said, I will provide both of you a ring soon, as I don't have any extras just laying about," Nick said, and they both looked disappointed. "What I do have is the ring Helena used before her current one that gives her a corporeal body, but no magic. You will need to share while I prepare the individual rings, but I doubt that will bother either of you all that much," he added, and took out the original Nasphere ring from Greed. It was funny to watch the 2 ghosts haggle out the exact timeline for who gets to wear it, and for how long before settling the matter with rock, paper, scissors. 252. Chapter 252. The Fat Friar got the first shift with the ring, much to nearly headless Nick's disappointment. All the ghosts save for Helena were chased out of the workshop after that, since Nick wanted to get the rings done as soon as possible. It honestly wouldn't take very long, all things considered, as he merely needed until a bit before dinner to finish making them. If it wasn't for the fact that the crafting style took a while to slowly fill the entire vessel, he could be done much faster. Still, Nick turned on the furnace to warm it up and started to prepare the mithril for the fire. First, he switched the furnace to cold fire and sent in an ingot of the stuff to melt it in the flames. Once done, he funneled the liquid metal into the molds and waited for it to solidify. The remainder was set in an ingot mold to create a smaller but still usable ingot. It took about half an hour for the metal in the ring molds to solidify enough to be enchanted. Removing the first ring from the mold and setting it on the anvil, Nick took out his hammer, and got to work enchanting the ring. 3 hours later, he tiredly finished up the first ring and set it aside before eating some lember's bread and sitting down to meditate in order to restore his energy faster. While he was no longer completely drained of energy from a single intensive forging like this, it did cost him nearly 3/4 of his total energy. Considering his young age and ever-increasing mastery of this method, that was actually pretty impressive. Anyone else his age would likely fall out in a terrible condition if they attempted to use even a single word in their enchantment, much like he did when he made Ota for Harry. The only reason he was able to create such potent enchantments was because of his abnormally powerful soul and large amounts of mana that both exceed his age by a wide margin. His control training with Helena had also proven useful for forging, as he now increased his efficiency in channeling his spirit. This meant he now wasted even less spiritual energy when enchanting things and no longer glowed as intensely when forging. The glow he had was actually the energy he was unable to keep in check, and as such dissipated into the atmosphere, so with him having better and better efficiency, it slowly vanished. Once he reached a certain level of control, he will simply stop glowing altogether while he channels his spirit energy. As soon as he fully restored his energy, and Stamina Nick stood up and removed the second ring from the mold before setting it on the anvil. He then went to work enchanting this ring much like the previous one. Just like before, it took him nearly 3 hours to complete the enchantment, but it was finally done. Taking one of his body enhancement potions out of greed, he drank it and felt the warmth of his muscles improving by a small amount in a short period of time. He was still growing thanks to his young age, so his current impressive physique was actually just the foundation for his future build. Unlike him, though, the muscles that Fred and George had from using the potion themselves were mostly superficial. Sure, they were stronger than if they hadn't used the potion, but they had prioritized appearance over function, unlike Nick, so while they also had strong physiques, it was mostly just for show. The two ghosts waiting outside slightly impatiently were thrilled when Nick walked out of the workshop and tossed them both a ring each while confiscating the original Nasphia ring from nearly headless Nick. After that, he headed to the great hall to eat dinner, but was stopped by Dumbledore in the hallway. I feel as though you should be warned that Cornelius will be arriving at Hogwarts tomorrow alongside a reporter from the Daily Prophet to interview you about your resurrected ghost rings, as the students have taken to calling them. The old man said seriously. Nick nodded, not surprised at all. I expected as much given the man's usual way of doing things. An event such as this is far too important for him to miss after all. That said, I appreciate the warning nonetheless, he said politely before continuing his walk to the great hall. Dumbledore chose not to look a gift horse in the mouth and silently accept the small amount of improvement in opinion he got for this warning. Changing someone as stubborn as Nick's mind about someone was a slow and arduous process, and he knew this and was more than happy to tread that path. 253. Chapter 253. Nick got a lot of odd and jealous looks from the other students, and a wrathful one from Lockhart at the professor table. Nick ignored all this, however, and sat down before digging into the food with gusto. After seeing that Nick had no intention of satisfying their curiosity, most chose to focus on their friends and food instead. A few more stubborn personalities remained focused on him, but he totally ignored them with the exception of Ginny Riddle. While no one else seemed to pick it up, Nick felt the malicious intent in the soul shard's magic and sighed. I was going to leave you alone for now, but since you insist on targeting me, I'll get rid of you early, he thought without any change in expression. After eating, Nick left the great hall and went to his workshop while leaving the door open on purpose. Considering how arrogant Riddle was, he doubted that the soul shard would miss the opportunity to catch him alone. He was right too, as shortly afterwards, Ginny Riddle walked into the workshop with a curious expression. Is this where you make all those amazing things? She asked while closing the door. Nick tapped his wand against the floor, and ropes immediately sprang out of the stone and bound Ginny Riddle while snatching the wand hidden in the right hand away. Don't bother trying to scream, the room is soundproof. I was originally going to leave you be, but you had to try and press your luck, didn't you, Tom? Nick asked casually, and Ginny Riddle's face twisted into a cold scowl. "How did you discover me?" she asked coldly. "Not that it matters all that much, but I am rather sensitive to magic, and Horcrux magic has an unmissable stench to it that is hard to mistake for anything else," Nick explained calmly while walking over to the bound individual. Reaching into the robes, Nick pulled out the worn black leather diary and decisively cut the connection to Ginny it had knocking her out. Taking out the Nazgul ring from Greed, Nick immediately disposed of the soul shard before replacing the diary in Ginny's robes and unbinding her. He then disillusioned himself and her before carrying her out of the workshop and to the infirmary. Leaving her on a bed, he removed the spell on her and left just as stealthily as he came. Riddle was so arrogant that he had never expected that he would have gotten caught so easily in a trap by a mere second year like Nick, no matter how talented. His plan was to try and use the fact that in normal cases, Nick wouldn't expect his friend's sister to attack him to sneak attack him. That may have been true if Nick didn't know both who he was possessing and could also sense the diary as easy as breathing. As for why Nick didn't keep the diary, it was so Ginny would simply assume that the thing had lost its enchantment, as old objects like that tend to. Even if she did remember what Riddle had used her body for and sought him out, Nick would simply deny the encounter. If she mentioned those memories, and the diary, he could mention how that sounded like a cursed object that messed with memories and should be gotten rid of. Nick turned into bed after that so that he was well rested for tomorrow's interview. He woke up at his normal dawn time and got dressed and ready for the day. After that, he waited in the workshop for Fudge and the interviewing reporter while also setting up a temporary enchantment locking ward. This will stop any sort of funny business from either of them, he thought calmly while sipping some tea he had brewed for this occasion. It was rude to host guests without offering refreshments after all. Clearly, Fudge and the interviewer, who unsurprisingly turned out to be Rita Skeeter, were eager for the interview as they arrived at 7 o'clock exactly. Fudge was all smiles as he walked into the workshop and greeted Nick. Next to him was a blonde woman with glasses and a shifty expression like she couldn't wait to find some flaw to write about. "Good morning, Headmaster, Minister Fudge, Madam Skeeter, would any of you like a cup of tea?" Nick said in his best impersonation of Dumbledore, which made the man himself behind them smirk. "I think I would quite enjoy a cup, thank you," Dumbledore said, clearly deciding to play along. Fudge looked completely uncomfortable at the situation, but Rita didn't seem to care and accepted the tea. Nick transfigured some chairs and a table for them to sit comfortably. "You'll have to forgive me for not having the best accommodations for guests, since this room is not usually intended for such an event as this," he said apologetically. 254. Chapter 254. Think nothing of it, my boy. We can all understand that a workshop is no place for guests normally, Fudge said, speaking up for the other two without their opinions. Dumbledore looked amused at it, but Rita had a slight twitch in her face that showed her irritation. "Do tell me how the tea is. I brewed it myself," Nick said with a smile. "It's quite nice, if I must say so myself. Do you perhaps have any spare leaves I might have?" Dumbledore said after trying the tea. Nick shook his head, afraid not. These leaves came from my ancestor's personal store that had been under stasis charm until recently, he said with a smirk. All three of his guests looked stunned at this revelation and looked at the light brown liquid like it was a treasure. "Do you mean to say that Rowena Ravenclaw herself drank this tea?" Fudge asked to confirm. Nick nodded, over 1,000 years ago, but yes. "So while I would like to give some out, I have a very limited quantity," he said honestly. "But enough about old tea leaves. You are here for my most recent achievement now," Nick said with a grin. Rita's face lit up when he said that and took out a clipboard and a quill that dropped to the ground when she released it. "What's going on?" she asked in surprise at this, as her spellwrite quill shouldn't have any issues at all. "Ah, that must be an enchanted quill if I am not mistaken," Nick asked, and she nodded. "I am sorry to say that due to the way outside spells affect my enchantments, no foreign magic functions within this room. I can provide you a normal quill to write with if you'd like," Nick said while making a generous offer. Rita looked suspicious, but after seeing how both Dumbledore and Fudge seemed to believe him, she could only accept the lack of her favorite quill and accept Nick's offer. Nick merely gave her the quill he was using originally, before he got his current phoenix feather one. She had it at the ready in an instant, proving she could still write even without her enchanted quill. To start us off with, perhaps you could introduce yourself to the readers, Rita said with a smile. My current full name is Nicholas Iron Ravenclaw, and I am an orphan as far as I am aware. Nick said calmly. My memory of myself only extends to about a year and 2 months ago, however, as I woke up in an alley with terrible injuries and amnesia at that time. I was briefly placed in an orphanage during after that where I started school, where I met my friend Harry. He was apparently bullied heavily before I went to the school and stood up to his main bully, his cousin. One thing led to another, and soon he was also living in my orphanage with me. It was there that I discovered both my magical ability as well as my gift with metal. Everything after that was pretty much just my time in Hogwarts and my apprenticeship under Garrick Ollivander over the summer. Nick said calmly, and couldn't help but chuckle at how little of himself he actually knew beyond his heritage. Rita was furiously scribbling on the clipboard's parchment even after he stopped speaking, but that was to be expected from her. Fudge and Dumbledore both looked sympathetic after hearing about his amnesia, though. Did you ever try to look for your relatives? Rita asked, uncaring about emotional turmoil at all. Nick shook his head. No, I believe that if I was truly wanted by some relative, they would have long since made some sort of move to find me, and yet there is nothing on either the muggle or magical side of things. To me, they are strangers, and so I will not seek them out, he said calmly. What about after your heritage was revealed, and you learned you were a descendant of Rowena Ravenclaw? Surely you must have been curious as to who your parents were, or if you were even pureblood to begin with, Rita pressed without mercy. Nick again shook his head. I honestly don't care about it since it makes no difference either way, he said honestly, and all three of them looked stunned at this answer. Rita looked excited after hearing this, however, as it was downright scandalous. A rather contentious statement, if I must say so. Care to elaborate? She asked eagerly. Nick chuckled but shook his head. No, we have gotten quite off topic as it is, and should return to it, since Minister Fudge and Headmaster Dumbledore are very busy people, and surely have better things to be doing than listening to my personal beliefs, he said forcefully, putting the conversation back on track, using the two political hegemons in the room as pressure on Rita. 255. Chapter 255. Rita noticed this and could only drop the subject to get back on track, as while she might be able to get away with offending one of these hegemons slightly both at once was political suicide. Very well then, can you tell us how you resurrected the ghosts? She asked, with a small amount of bite to show her displeasure at his manipulation. I need to correct this misunderstanding. The ghosts haven't been resurrected at all. All I have done is allowed them to have a corporeal form. So while they appear alive, the truth could not be further away, he said with a smile, ignoring her displeasure. Dumbledore didn't seem surprised at this correction, but both Fudge and Rita were stunned. Wouldn't it be easier to fully resurrect them instead? She asked curiously. Nick shook his head. To resurrect a ghost, nothing short of creating a whole new living body, perfectly suited to the spirit, would work. And even then you would need to somehow anchor the soul to the body correctly, which is borderline dark magic like necromancy. All I have done instead was turn water into ice effectively, he explained seriously. How so? She asked while writing on her clipboard. Ghosts, while incorporeal, have an inclination towards being solid, as is shown when they move through fire or smoke, and it disturbs them. What I did was push this inclination to actually turning solid instead. This let them eat, touch things, and actually interact with their surroundings, which makes them appear to be alive when they are still just ghosts. Nick explained calmly. How did you accomplish this feat? Rita asked, and Nick shook his head. That is a proprietary piece of knowledge, unfortunately, and can't be shared, he said, and she frowned, but left it alone. Why did you decide to create this ghost solidification enchantment to begin with? Rita asked, moving the topic away from the how and over to the why. It is no secret that I spend a lot of time with my deceased relative Helena Ravenclaw, or better known as the Grey Lady. As such, I was aware of how miserable being a ghost was, and most of that misery came from not being able to taste or touch anything. I then paid attention to the state of her existence and carefully put a theory of mine into practice, and well, the result is obvious. He explained calmly. Rita was writing furiously in her clipboard, and he had a suspicion on the sort of bullshit she was writing. Probably some disgusting thing about how he did it due to some sort of romantic connection. He didn't care, however, as slandering people was her modus operandi, and everyone knew it. After Rita kept trying to change the subject to other things, such as his magical talents, future plans, and other such useless stuff that Nick left purposefully lacking in any flavor or way she could twist that got under her skin. Oh, right, how silly of me to forget. This handsome fellow on my shoulder is Dusk, a ho-ho that was living in my ancestral home. His favorite thing to do is to burn away any bugs that happen to find their way in here. His favorite is, of course, beetles. I've seen him slowly burn away their legs and then the rest of their bodies. Thankfully, they were just normal bugs, since I doubt I could stop him if it was something like an animagi instead. Nick said, while looking at Rita especially, who was sweating and had a fearful look on her face. Fudge didn't seem to understand how that was important information, but Dumbledore was far from stupid and quickly figured out what was going on. So that's how she gets her information. It would appear she has chosen the wrong target for slander this time. The old goat thought with a small smile as he watched Nick basically threaten the reporter. Rita herself was also not stupid and had figured out that Nick was aware of her illegal animagus status and was not so subtly telling her to not try and twist his words or straight up lie about him in her article. She could only grit her teeth and accept this as she drew a line through all the false stuff she had written down. She wanted to obliviate him so that her secret was safe, but all the information she had gathered about Nick said that she would have a better chance fighting off a group of Death Eaters instead. Not only was she aware that he had on 8 protective rings that automatically activated, but also that his reactions to being attacked or wronged in some way are extremely cruel. 256. Chapter 256. The interview ended shortly afterwards, as Rita wanted nothing more than to stay far away from Nick at that point. Nick, of course, played the role of host flawlessly and saw them out of the workshop and down the hall politely. Once they were gone, he immediately took down the magical restriction ward in the workshop. Contrary to how it may seem, he was very much affected by the thing as it shut his magical senses inside his body, leaving him uncomfortably blind to his surroundings. He then locked the door to the workshop and cranked on the furnace, as he had an idea how to open the chamber himself since he had destroyed the Horcrux. So his idea was to create a ring that forced his magical ability to allow him to speak Parseltongue on purpose. Sure, it would only be useful when he needed to speak that particular language, but that was fine, since he could just sell the ring to the system after he was done with it. Switching the flame to dragon flame after it warmed up, Nick grabbed a small ingot of silver and tossed it into the furnace. Once workable, he took it out of the fire and placed it on the anvil before taking out his hammer and a round tip punch to open a hole in the middle. He was gentle when he struck the end of the punch, so as to not mess up the metal, as he slowly created a divot in the center of the metal bar. Flipping it, he repeated this process on the opposite side in the same location. He had to stop in order to reheat the metal, but after that he got the hole through the middle. Placing the bar on its side, he then slowly started to open the hole wider without stressing the metal. He did this by gently rounding the inside edge of the hole on both sides. Once the hole was wide enough, he placed a ring mandrel in it before rounding the outside of the bar into a band shape. He needed to reheat it a couple times during this process, but he made it in the end with the ring being a thick silver band with rough edges and no design. From there, however, he carefully took a thin file to the band to carve out the shape of a coiled serpent into the band. This included individual scales, the head, and the body taper with the coils looking to rest beside the next. He even included the belly scales and underside as he did so, which created a rough outline for him to follow. Since this filing had to be done cold and very precisely, it took him 2 hours to get a semi-lifelike silver snake ring finished. It was very large for a ring, but Nick knew it would change size with his auto-sizing feature. All that was left was to polish it and enchant it for it to be done. Nick stored away the semi-finished ring before heading to the Great Hall for lunch, since it was close to that time. Meal went by uneventfully, and so he went back to working on the ring with the polishing and finally the enchantment. This time he used 4 words while hammering the enchantment into it: Lok, snake; Lamba, tongue; K, speak; and Tur, power. These words alongside his intent and the knowledge he used as the base of the enchantment created the following ring. Ring name: K-Lok grade. Rare abilities: auto-sizing, parcel tongue speech description. A ring that forces its wearer to speak in the language of snakes. System appraisal: and strange ring created by an up and coming ring smith. Nick took off one of his protective rings and slipped on this ring, which shrunk down considerably to fit on his finger snugly. Then he spoke, testing of the ring's ability. Immediately he felt the subtle change in his magical ability that told him he had succeeded in making a ring that allowed him to easily open the Chamber of Secrets. Taking the ring off and storing it into greed, since he didn't feel like speaking only snake tongue all the time, he called it a day for work. He still had another hour or two before dinner time, so he headed to the room of requirements to set up the ritual of reflexes. It was honestly not going to take very long at all to complete, since there was no real requirements besides the ingredients. He still needed to create the ritual circle, but otherwise he was totally prepared already. The ritual circle had the runes written in a specific pattern within it, and once set up, Nick took out the acromantula heart and started the ritual. 257. Chapter 257. Ritual circle lit up, and Nick felt the changes take place in his body as the acromantula heart slowly turned to ash. It was a strange tingling at first, before turning into an intense burning as all of his nerves grew more perfect and connected, increasing his perception of the world drastically. He passed out directly when the changes to his brain began to accommodate this sudden increase in reaction time. He woke up when the changes stopped 5 minutes later and immediately felt the difference. It was a bit like moving in slow motion as he perceived the world around him, but his body couldn't move at the same speed he was perceiving it. The disconnect wasn't huge, but definitely noticeable, like each of his actions were just a moment after his thoughts. This is going to take me a while to get used to, he thought as he left the room, which reset it, entirely erasing any trace of his ritual. Once out of the sealed environment of the room of requirements, Nick felt the biggest difference from before the ritual. He could literally feel the air currents around him, despite how subtle they are, and it bothered him greatly. So this must be what spiders feel all the time. No wonder they can react so fast, he thought as he felt the gentle air flow around him, moving in a manner not unlike that of flowing water. Or at the very least, that's what it felt like to him at the moment. Thanks to the improved connection between his neurons, Nick also thought faster than before sun. He had these thoughts within mere moments, rather than a few seconds. It was thanks to this that, when his ears heard the sound of rustling robes, and he felt the airflow change, he was beginning to move to take out his wand and block the attack. Obliviate. A certain male voice spoke, but even when the malicious intention spell came from the assailant's wand, Nick was already dropping down and in turning to dodge it, as well as get into position to counter. The green spell flew past Nick's right side harmlessly, and he pointed his wand at a well-dressed man with a rapidly morphing facial expression from glee to horror. Petrificus totalis. Nick spoke angrily, and the petrification charm shot out of the tip of his wand in a blinding fashion as he overcharged it in his rage. While he was protected from the effect of the obliviate charm, thanks to his occlumency and Sana, it didn't change the fact that Lockhart had just tried to erase his memories. Why the man was even on the 7th floor at all was totally irrelevant at this point, and it was only Celebrimber's voice in his head, stopping him from blasting the bastard into literal pieces. It would be oh so easy just to use a blasting curse or even an overpowered splitting charm to reduce the man to a red smear on the walls. Nick didn't do that, however, but rather paralyzed the man and waved his wand to strip the wand out of his hand. Walking over to Lockhart, he directly kicked the man's legs out from under him before tapping the ground, causing a stone horse to come out of it, with the man draped across its back. All the professors and Nick's friends knew something was wrong as the weather rapidly shifted from sunny to near hurricane in no time at all. Nick was absolutely livid, and his magical ability was running out of control instinctively. Everyone felt an intense pressure weighing down on them before the sound of horse hooves showed up. The first professor to track down the source of the disturbance was Dumbledore, thanks to his own sensitivity to magic and connection to the castle wards. He had a stern expression as he recognized the look in Nick's eyes all too well as one of near mind-consuming wrath. He had had that same look the day that his heritage was revealed to the world, and it suddenly made sense why the weather had turned so violent. It was magic similar to that of a thunderbird's, but far more potent due to not having any finesse at all behind it, but pure emotion, and not a good one. Nick saw Dumbledore and pressed his wand against his forehead before flicking the memory of the event at the old man and leaving as Dumbledore let it sink into his head. He left Lockhart behind to be dealt with by Dumbledore, as he still had enough reason left to know he needed to leave before he caved in and killed the man. 258. Chapter 258. Dumbledore Parv. I watched the memory that I had been given with more than a little irritation, as I already had an idea of what happened. It wasn't hard to figure out, to be honest, if one paid attention to details. Gilderoy Lockhart was a showman with an overinflated ego that wanted nothing more than to be the center of attention. Any skill he may have had when he left Hogwarts originally was clearly gone at this point, which was confusing if his merited work was to be believed. The truth, however, quickly became clear in this memory. The man had simply foregone all other magics in exchange for a single one that he clearly used often. Obliviate, a nasty spell that I wish wasn't necessary to keep the wizarding world secret that erases memories. It took me a mere moment after seeing the skill behind the spell used by the man to piece together the pieces of the puzzle, and I don't like the conclusion I came to. Lockhart had likely taken other wizard and witches' credit for these accomplishments, while erasing their knowledge of them, even having done it themselves. The memory was so tinted by rage after that I had to activate my own occlumency abilities to keep it from infecting me as well. I was impressed by Nick's self-control in the face of such raw, violent emotions. Even if the rather hard kick to Lockhart's legs to knock him over showed, he felt the need to hurt the man. Once I returned to reality from the memory, I could only look at the paralyzed man on the stone-transfigured horse with a frown. Taking out my wand, I pressed it forward, expecto patronum, I said, and a spectral phoenix flew out of the tip before rapidly vanishing down the hallway in search of Severus. I dismissed the transfiguration, which sank into the floor, restoring the total mass of the castle. I then conjured ropes to bind Lockhart before removing Nick's petrification of the man before applying my own. Perhaps Nick hadn't realized it, but his anger at the time of casting the petrification charm had corrupted it slightly to slowly cause Lockhart to suffocate. Had it been lifted any later, and it may have caused actual damage to the man's brain. A few moments later, Severus came around the corner at a fast walk, carrying a vial of golden potion with a deep glare. There's an empty classroom nearby. We can use that to administer the Veritaserum, I say softly, and he merely nods, quiet even for him. I couldn't blame him, however, as this matter was very serious and could have wide-reaching consequences. It wasn't as simple as Lockhart merely attacking a normal student, but had several other factors that could inflate this case greatly. For example, how the student he attacked was the heir to House Ravenclaw, or the fact that he may have obliviated any number of wizards illegally. Azkaban was a guaranteed outcome for the man, but the exact sentence depended on exactly what this truth serum would reveal. My biggest concern, however, was the storm raging outside the castle that I could hear howling and rumbling in constant reminder of the very short-fused student that needed time to calm down. After Lockhart was strapped to a chair in the empty room, I woke him up with the energizing spell, Re-Innovate. I spoke, and his eyes shot open immediately, and he looked confused for a moment before opening his mouth, likely to spew some nonsense about being attacked. Severus, however, immediately shoved the now open vial of Veritaserum into the man's mouth, causing him to choke and sputter for a moment as the potion seeped down his throat. Name, Severus spoke sternly once the telltale glazed eyes showed up on the man. Gilderoy Lockhart, the drugged man said in a monotone. Severus looked at me and nodded to show that the potion was working as intended. While it was normally illegal to use veritasrum on an unwilling person, that law had a clause that stated that so long as it was administered by a ministry-approved individual, it was still admissible. Severus, as one of the few Grandmaster potioneers, was automatically counted as a ministry-approved person. Did you attack Nicholas Ravenclaw with malicious intent? I asked, familiar with court-approved interrogation etiquette. Yes, the man said blandly. Why? I pressed. I intended to take his accomplishments for myself, since he didn't deserve them. The man spoke, and Severus visibly grit his teeth, and I myself also felt more than a little anger at this answer. How did you plan to take these accomplishments? I asked, holding down my temper, but both Severus and I needed to step out of the room after hearing the answer, lest we act on our anger. 259. Chapter 259. Nick, meanwhile, was already in the castle's courtyard, letting the rain and wind wash over him as he raised his wand high above his head and simply let his rage and magic flow through it. A dense, bright beam of lightning flew from the tip of the wand into the clouds above harmlessly, but Nick felt better after venting out his anger at the sky. Oh, he was still livid, but at least now he wasn't likely to do anything stupid in his anger. He ignored the terrible weather, however, and walked the castle grounds as the weight of his wet robes clung to him. The wind pushed against him, and his hair fluttered every which way, but he was otherwise unaffected by it. Nick found a log near the lake that he sat down on and stared off at the sky above while slowly calming himself. The weather also slowly receded and changed from a terrible storm to mere rain as he did so. The students inside the castle also relaxed as this happened and began to speculate as to what caused the storm to begin with. Most simply chose to believe that it was a freak storm that had happened a few times in history. Nick's friends, however, were searching all over the castle for him, but couldn't find him in any of the usual places. Not the workshop or library, and not in the courtyard of the castle, where he liked to hang out to read. They checked the great hall, but he wasn't there either, and so they were all at a loss. Luna was especially insistent on them finding him and kept looking at the sky outside the windows with a worried expression. It was ironically through such an act that they spotted his dark figure sitting at the lake's edge on a sun-bleached log. It was raining, however, so they were hesitant to go running out into it and getting soaked through. Luna had no such concern and immediately left the castle in a dash towards where he was. Harry was the next to do so, and the rest followed shortly afterwards. Nick had a blank look as he stared at the sky above while the rain fell on his face. He noticed his friends approaching him from behind, but didn't react to their presence. His mind was calm, but empty as he focused entirely on the sky above. It may as well have been a sort of meditation that instead of focusing inside, focused on the outside instead. It was frankly terrifying to Luna, as despite being able to see his magic, since he wasn't restricting it, she still couldn't read him at all. It was like looking at a natural fixture in the magic of the surroundings and blended in with the world itself. She knew immediately that it was wrong. People weren't meant to be blank and without intent or emotion. At the very least, that was what her experience told her, as even babies had emotions and intents if a bit out of control. If a Buddhist were to know of this, however, they would feel privileged, as one in such a state of emptiness was a holy and enlightened state of mind. Luna neither knew of this nor cared, as she immediately hugged Nick from behind, snapping his mind out of that state. He was calm, however, and merely looked at his friends before tapping the log he was on, turning it into a long bench. "You all right, mate?" Ron asked, worried. "Yeah, I just needed a moment to calm down after Lockhart attacked me," Nick said honestly. "He did what?" Nearly all of them exclaimed at the same time. "He attempted to obliviate me, but failed, and I imagine is currently getting interrogated by Dumbledore. Azkaban is the best place he can go because anything less, and he won't be breathing soon," Nick said coldly, with more than a little murderous intent that made Luna shiver on his back. He retracted his magic under his skin at that point, as he had honestly not realized she was there till now. It was like waking up after being asleep with someone holding you. You simply wouldn't register that information until a change happened, like you or the other person moving or making noise. "You can let me go now, you know." he suggested, but the pale silver eyes that looked up at him from over his shoulder said that she didn't believe him. He could only sigh and leave her be. After the scare he likely gave them all with his not-so-little explosion of anger. Focusing his wand at the sky above, he channeled his magic into the clouds and willed them to disperse. 260. Chapter 260. It took a few moments, and it drained a considerable amount of power, but the rain stopped, and the clouds slowly thinned. Tapping his wand on his robes, he drew out the water in them before letting it fall to the ground with a splash. He repeated this for the rest of his friends, since wet clothes made it easier to get sick. "Think the git will get a life sentence?" Ron asked, breaking the silence. "Seems like the sort of thing that would land you a sentence like that," Tracy said seriously. "Father told me once about how ruthless the ministry is with things like this. Making an example is what he says." Ron said seriously. "Muggles do it too, you know," Nick said quietly. "Zero-tolerance policy, they call it, punishing folk regardless of the crime severely. It's supposed to keep the regular people in line with the law, but it simply doesn't work very well." He added with shake of his head. "What do you mean?" Hermione asked with a frown. "Circumstances is what I am talking about. There are 4 types of criminals, from what I can tell: lifestyle, malicious, career, and accidental. See, lifestyle criminals are those who grew up in it and simply don't know any different. Malicious criminals are those that actively choose to commit crimes because they enjoy it. Career criminals are those who turn to crime out of nothing more than simple greed. The accidental criminals are those that commit a crime accidentally or in a fit of passion and regret it deeply afterwards. In a case involving the exact same crime, each of these criminals gets the exact same punishment regardless of intent or circumstances, and they call it justice. In truth, it simply doesn't work because it doesn't target the crux of the issue for the individual criminal," he explained with a scowl. "Does the ministry or government know all this?" Ron asked with a worried expression. "They do. My father once mentioned how unjust some of the punishments were after reading the papers in the morning, but I didn't know what he meant until now," Daphne said with a bothered expression. "Why don't they just change the system if it doesn't work?" Hermione asked, genuinely confused. "They can't. Our entire civilization is propped up on this flawed system, and while they might spend years at a time tweaking each individual law to try and get as close as possible to true justice, but it's simply not possible. There is no one-size-fits-all justice that they can implement, hence it's all circumstantial," Nick said honestly. Everyone got quiet at this, as none of them could find a good way to deny what he said, as it made perfect sense. "As for Lockhart, he'll probably be driven mad in no time at all in Azkaban," Nick said with more than a little pleasure at the idea. "Weak-willed people would definitely not maintain their sanity for very long in an environment that constantly saps the happiness out of them." This was very literal in this case, as the Dementors literally ate happiness, so getting sent to Azkaban was a very bad experience. Back to the interrogation of Lockhart, both Dumbledore and Snape had become numb to the anger after listening to Lockhart narrate his long list of crimes. Then there was the old wizard in Romania that was dealing with that coven of vampires. I posed as a reporter for that one before catching him off guard once I had the full story. The blonde spoke almost passionately about his various conquests while under the effects of Veritaserum. By the end of the 2-hour-long interrogation, both Dumbledore and Snape were totally disgusted by Lockhart. "I will contact the ministry about the official arrest of his while you seek out the boy about the curse. We will also need to find a replacement for the defense against the dark arts position with haste. I believe the boy had some idea on that matter and thus should be able to assist," Dumbledore said, and Snape nodded before turning to walk out of the room. "And Severus, be understanding with the boy. He may not be in the best state of mind," the old man called out, and besides a small flick of his wrist, Snape made no motion that he heard him. Dumbledore turned to look at the dosed Lockhart with a sigh before knocking him out with a simple, stunning charm. "Let's hope this is the last issue we have to deal with for a while," he thought before leaving the man tied up in the room to write the letters he needed in his office. 261. Chapter 261. Snape Parv. I scoffed to myself when the old man told me to treat the young man with understanding, as if he was some normal brat. Nicholas Ravenclaw was many things, but normal was not one of them. In his same situation, I very much doubt any other student would have hesitated for a second to either flee in panic or violently attack Lockhart. That he instead turned the man in despite his justifiable anger showed a level of self-control few possess. The thing that concerned me instead was the boy's rapidly growing power. He hid it well, but it showed, if you were to pay attention, small things like the fact most of his spells were overpowered by a large amount, or even the silent transfigurations he employs without hiding at all. There had even been an increasingly more adept and powerful level to the enchanted items as well. I had noticed it by observing one of the first rings of protection he sold, as well as the newest set. The new enchantment was more stable, and I wasn't even sure the boy knew it could now block 2 attacks before crumbling instead of 1. This showed a drastically improved efficiency in the enchantment, which was frightening to say the least. I myself had only seen such a level of improvement in a field twice in my life. The first was myself, when I first started to delve into the art of potions and spell work. The second was Lily Evans, whom I still sorely miss. She was the most brilliant magical individual in our generation, with a mind that allowed her to master nearly any field with little effort. She was especially gifted in charms, and created dozens of spells from scratch in our time as students. The boy, instead, was supremely gifted in enchantment and transfiguration, and had a not small amount of talent in potions as well. No, talent wasn't the right word to describe his ability in potions. It was almost as if he was intimately familiar with the subject already. I had already figured out how he approached the subject, and though I am loath to admit it, the Muggle knowledge of chemistry did work well in the subject. Unlike most wizards, I did not ignore the prowess that the Muggles had in their sciences, and even used some of that information myself. As such, I couldn't help but notice the almost scientific way he approached the brewing of potions. My mind was occupied with these thoughts as I walked through the castle in search of the person in question. It surprised me to find him with the other students he called friends sitting on a bench at the lake's edge. I was even more surprised to see how calm he was, as if his anger had simply evaporated. The boy glanced at me as I approached, and something about his golden eyes unnerved me as I got stared down. "You'll have to excuse me while I go speak with the professor," the boy said, and his friends looked surprised as they only just noticed me at that moment. He stood up and walked over to where I was standing calmly, but I noticed the wand in his hand. Considering he had already been attacked today, his caution was understandable. "Muffliato," I spoke, making it impossible to eavesdrop on the conversation. "I was sent to inform you of the need for your assistance in removing the curse on the defense against the dark arts position. I was also told you may be of assistance in finding a suitable replacement for the recently dismissed professor," I said bluntly. The boy didn't look surprised at all to hear what I said, which made sense since all of this was his idea to begin with. "Give me a moment to settle things with my friends, and I'll be right along," he said, and I nodded. After the boy handled his friends, we went back into the castle, but not to the defense against the dark arts classroom like I had expected, but rather to the headmaster's office. The boy seemed to have anticipated my confusion and explained the reason behind this action. "I am familiar with the school wards as they are currently, and as a result, can't remove the curse without someone familiar with its previous state with me," he said, and I understood what he was talking about. It was like trying to remove an impurity in a potion that you hadn't brewed. You would first need to know what the impurity was before you could focus on removing it, which might require the brewer themselves. "Lemon drops." I spoke the password, which caused the griffin statue to move aside, revealing the stairs to the office. 262. Chapter 262. Followed Snape into the office calmly and noticed Dumbledore hunched over his desk, writing on a sheet of parchment. The old man seemed to notice them, but continued writing for a couple moments before tapping the parchment with his wand. This caused the letter to fold itself and slip into an envelope that he then wrote a name on and handed to Fawkes. "I am terribly sorry for the actions of Gilderoy Lockhart this evening. When I hired him for the position, I truly thought he was harmless, if a bit dull," Dumbledore said sincerely. You reported him to the ministry already, correct? Nick asked seriously. That letter is my report on the matter after Severus, and I interrogated the man under Veritaserum. To think such a foul individual was prancing about so openly. Dumbledore said with a sigh and a shake of his head. In this regard you ought to be applauded, as without your capture and reporting of him, he would likely have gotten away with it. He added on honestly. Nick shook his head. So long as he gets a proper punishment, I would rather not think of the man if that's all right with you, he said, and the old goat nodded. I understand. I take it you are here for the two issues Severus was meant to discuss with you, correct? Dumbledore asked calmly. Nick nodded. I need your assistance in removing the curse due to the reason Professor Flitwick has already likely informed you of, he said, and Dumbledore nodded. As for the matter of the Dada position, there are a few possibilities, in fact, Nick said with the smallest hint of a grin. Both Dumbledore and Snape seemed surprised at this, as they honestly couldn't think of any solutions to this problem, much less several. What are these options? If it's not too much trouble, explain your reasons, as well as we would very much appreciate it if you did, Dumbledore said with a look of interest. First is to convince Horace Slughorn to return to Hogwarts as the potions teacher, while Professor Snape here takes the defense position. The second is to give hire Sirius Black for the position, since from my understanding of the man, he is quite skilled at the subject. Inversely, you could hire Lupin as well for the same reason, so long as I create a werewolf ring for him to have full control of his transformation. The final option, of course, is to hire Alistair Moody for the position, since he is more than qualified, Nick explained with a slightly widening grin. He couldn't help but get excited by the prospect of each of these possible ideas. I can understand myself and Alistair Moody, and even Lupin, Snape said, with the final name being especially venomous sounding. But Sirius Black is a terrible choice for the position with his mentality. He finished clearly upset, the mere idea of sharing space with Sirius. Nick shrugged. While I can understand your hatred of the man due to his past actions, I can also not dismiss his ability from an unbiased standpoint. To be fair, though, I believe having you take the position to be the best outcome due to your intimate familiarity with the subject, Nick said honestly. We appreciate your candor in this matter, but this will require serious discussion before a decision is made, Dumbledore said, and Snape nodded ever so slightly. With that settled, I can begin the process of removing the curse, if you would be so kind as to show me the affected part of the ward, Nick said, changing the subject. Dumbledore stood up and walked over to the nearby wall that had all the portraits of the previous headmasters on it and tapped it on a specific spot with his wand. Nick took this time to examine the Elder Wand with his magical senses, but felt a slight chill when he found it returning the stare. The Elder Wand possessed intelligence. He thought in horror that he had to fight to keep off his face. This was a very big deal, as it meant whoever had crafted it was way more skilled than even Ollivander. Nick stopped trying to examine the wand and instead focused on the wall that was sliding open to reveal what was the biggest ward stone he had ever heard of. The biggest in recorded history was merely 3 feet squared, but this ward stone was nearly triple that and looked like a very large boulder covered in various runes and enchantments. It glowed so brightly in his magical senses that Nick needed to turn them off entirely to prevent the veins in his nose from bursting at it. 263. Chapter 263. Dumbledore tapped the ward stone, and a colorful array of magic appeared in mid-air. He then waved his wand, skillfully navigating the huge variety of magics until he came to one specific part. It was dark purple and swirled sinisterly around some of the oldest parts of the magic. Nick took out his wand and placed the tip against his chest above his heart. Per sanguinem meum alligatum gloriam meme futuram vida. My blood-bound glory see my future, he spoke, and his heartbeat resounded throughout the room, and the magics of the ward stone resonated with it, adding a blinding white and gold magical imprint to the ward stone. Nick closed his eyes and sucked in a breath of air as he felt the connection to the wards get created. All right, I will isolate the curse now. Get ready to rip it out, he said seriously, and Dumbledore nodded with a stern expression as he had the wand pointed at the flowing magic at the ready. Nick slowly started to, will his imprint to flow around the imprint left by Voldemort carefully. There was a bit of a delay, as it took a moment for his imprint to follow his intent, but it slowly crept around the sinister purple magic. The curse was adaptive, however, and immediately felt a threat to itself from his imprint, and lashed out. Nick coughed up blood as the damage to himself recoiled through his connection. He grit his teeth, however, and willed his imprint to fully entrap the curse that continued to attack it. Blood vessels burst in his eyes, nose, and ears, much to the concern of both Snape and Dumbledore, but Nick eventually succeeded in isolating the curse. "Do it," he said weakly, and Dumbledore went to work excising the curse like a cancerous tumor. Nick went weak as the curse went through its final fits of resistance before it was removed, and Snape firmly held him up. "You've done enough, child. Rest now. Take him to Poppy," Dumbledore said, and Snape helped Nick walk out of the office. Once they were gone, the old wizard turned towards the shining magics and looked at the white and golden magic with interest. While the founders had cleverly left this backdoor for their descendants, in secret, it did not mean that the nature of it wasn't recorded. Each imprint was tailor-made for the person who left it and showed the headmaster their true nature. For example, Voldemort's imprint had been fused with a curse that made it clever and violent. Nick's imprint interested Dumbledore greatly, as it was the second best thing to get a firm read on Nick to legilimency. What he found, though, surprised him, as it was not truly white, but rather a myriad of colors fused together to appear white like a rainbow. The gold, on the other hand, was different entirely, as it didn't fit any personality trait, and he couldn't tell what it meant. Madame Pomfrey, however, when Nick arrived with Snape to the infirmary, was not happy. "Why is it that you always seem to show up with something dreadfully wrong with you?" she asked in irritation while using a diagnosis spell on him. She frowned, however, as she got back the results. "I don't know what you've been doing, but your body is on the verge of collapse. Damaged nerves, burst vessels, and to top it off, you have a crack on your magical core. Thankfully, your core is larger and sturdier than most your age, so you aren't at risk to become a squib," she said seriously. "Magical core? What's that?" Nick asked weakly, since that sounded like something really important. "Contrary to what most wizards would like to believe, we are actually very similar to magical beast in that we have a series of pathways in our bodies that allow magic to flow through them. The location where all these pathways meet up is a spot we have named the magical core. It's different for each location, but is always located within the torso, or in rare cases even the head, but that's 1 in a billion to happen," she said, indulging his curiosity. "Is damaging the core bad?" Nick asked, worried he might have ruined himself on accident. "Damage to the core merely results in a temporary loss of a certain amount of magic via dissipation until it heals. If the core isn't large and strong enough to handle that loss, the wizard is rendered a squib from the degradation of the magical pathways from atrophy. You are going to be fine so long as you rest and keep the stress on your core to a minimum for at least a month," she said, and Nick could only hopelessly agree to take it easy for an entire month. 264. Chapter 264. Nick kept his condition from his friends, since he didn't want them to worry for no reason. The entire school was in uproar the next day, however, since Aurors had come to the school the previous night and arrested Lockhart. Despite the Daily Prophet's headline being about Nick and the interview, he had very few people in the school cared, but not all. "Look, Nick, you're on the front page." Ron pointed at the picture of Nick with Dumbledore, Fudge, and Skeeter that was clearly taken when none of them were paying attention. Judging from how Carlin Creevy was beaming at the photo, it was pretty clear where it came from. It was merely the first of many times. Nick joked with a grin, earning smiles from those around despite the many rolled eyes. "Reckon they'll put the arrest on the front page tomorrow. It's what I do after all," Ron said offhandedly, and everyone in the know cringed at his insensitivity. Nick shook his head at that, though. "I'm not some fragile snowflake that can't take a reminder even if it wasn't intended. Ron is right, though, about it being the headline for tomorrow. It's just far too rich to miss out on for the Prophet," he said with a smile. "Aye, Prophet's been working hard to distract people about Grindelwald's actions of late to keep down the panic, but it's been an uphill battle from what I know." Seamus cut into the conversation from nearby at the long table. "How do you know that?" Hermione asked, confused and doubtful. My best mate Dean here wants to be a reporter after Hogwarts and has been talking to the folk at the Prophet to get some references after he graduates. They let it slip in one of the letters. Seamus said, while grabbing Dean Thomas to show him off. Straight from the horse's mouth, huh? Yup, that'll definitely count as good proof. Nick said with a nod. I find it a bit strange that the man hasn't been caught yet. Whole towns sacrificed for some unknown reason, and the person responsible leaves no trace of his whereabouts, suspicious to say the least. Hermione said, and Nick shook his head again. There's nothing strange about it at all, really. The man is not only an extremely powerful wizard, but he is also a natural seer. He can simply see any potential ambushes ahead of time and avoid them. He said, and Hermione went quiet. If that's true, how'd he get caught last time? Harry asked, confused. Last time he realized that Dumbledore was the final obstacle in his way and purposefully allowed himself to be caught in a duel to decide the fate of the wizarding world. He lost that duel and was captured. Nick said honestly, since this was all public information. So all we have to do is wait for Dumbledore to duel him again and win again. Ron said with a relieved expression. It's not that simple this time, I'm afraid. Last time both of them dueled, they were roughly equal in terms of both health and power. This time, however, Grindelwald has made himself younger, while Dumbledore is still an old man. The only real advantage Dumbledore has now is that he has had all this time to improve his power and skill even further from that time, while Grindelwald has stagnated to a degree in the last 50 years. It's tough to say who would win if they truly fought again. Nick said seriously, and everyone who heard him looked horrified. He didn't mention that Dumbledore also had the Elder Wand as well, since that wasn't the sort of information you hand out carelessly. Most didn't even know the Deathly Hallows were real, much less that two of them were in this school at the exact same moment. Nick hadn't thought all that much about the Hallows, to be honest, since they clearly operated on a set of rules that he didn't quite understand. Stressing himself to try and figure out those rules was simply not worth the effort on his part. Sure, the things were powerful, but he was pretty sure they were also cursed with misfortune. Every previous wielder of the wand had met an ill fate without exception, and each person who used the stone knowingly tended to go insane. The only real exception to this was the cloak, but Nick had a sneaking suspicion that was only because it had been passed down in the Peverell bloodline all this time and had no reason to curse its users. This also explained why Harry lived a full and good life after Voldemort's defeat, despite having possessed all three before. As the last living descendant of the Peverell bloodline, Harry was immune to the curse on the Hallows. 265. Chapter 265. Everyone went to their classes after that, and the rest of the day was fairly normal for Nick. He did learn something interesting, however, that honestly got him a little excited. Apparently, while the position was vacant for the time being, Dumbledore himself had taken up teaching the subject of Dada. This was a wonderful thing in Nick's opinion, since despite his character flaws, the old goat definitely knew how to teach. He had been one of the previous Dada teachers before Armando Dippet stepped down from his position as headmaster and handed to roll over to him. The old goat was also the previous professor of Transfiguration before he gave that position to McGonagall. The crazy thing is that the previous headmaster of the school is still alive today at the old age of 354. Regardless of anything else, Dumbledore knew his stuff when it came to teaching the subject. This meant that the education of the students would finally get a stabilized foundation. That was the thing about having a new teacher every year. The students' learning suffered as a result. For the older students, they were kinder out of luck in this regard, as they won't really get the benefit of a stable education. But for the younger students like Nick and his friends, it was a mighty fine opportunity. The best part was that Dumbledore apparently had a habit of sharing useful information not normally taught if the class showed the right motivation. For example, each and every student taught by the man, when he was the Dada professor, learned how to cast the Patronus charm. Granted, that was only for the 4th years and above, but the principle still stood. No student of the old man's was truly mediocre unless they chose that for themselves. Nick surprised his friends by hanging out with them in the workshop as he worked on enchanting with the Daedric runes, since he was supposed to be relaxing. It should come as no small surprise that the Daedric runes were exceptional at manipulating space, souls, fire, flesh, and life force, considering their origins. They were so good at it, in fact, that Nick had to actively make sure not to include any symbols related to those subjects, or the enchantment warped to include them in strange ways. For example, when he tried to enchant a ring to create water and accidentally created a blood fountain, it was very messy. He had also offered to tutor his friends in creation, but was surprised to learn that out of all of them only Ran had any talent with veritology. To be specific, he was almost prodigious with wood, and easily soaked up the knowledge Nick had on the subject. He was a bit clumsy at first using the tools Nick had to shape wood, but he rapidly improved. Hermione and Daphne both showed great promise with runes on the other hand, and with his knowledge of exact translation were quickly picking up the subject. Harry had no talent at all with any form of crafting, which was fine by him since he was really good at charms, flying, and Dada-type stuff. Tracy, surprisingly, was actually fairly talented at metalwork instead. As Nick's most advanced field of knowledge, he easily guided her in the proper way to work each type of metal, as well as a good diet and exercise plan to really pick up the skill. Luna was the odd woman out in this way, however, as she refused to learn any of the things he was willing to teach. Flitwick had apparently heard the commotion of all of this work going on and checked in to see what was happening. My word. I simply cannot express my joy to see so many of my students showing an interest in craftsmanship, the small man said with so much happiness, he actually cried a little. I noticed that I was starting to distance myself from my friends and figured I may as well see if any of them could learn from me in any way, besides my own person crafting method, of course. Nick said honestly. He meant it too since at this point Voldemort was a non-threat and will be taken care of soon enough. Compared to the bullshit he had to deal with in the future, the Dark Lord was the least of his concerns. Nick had also realized that he needed powerful allies at his side to deal with the future, and who better than his friends to take that job. I am glad you have seen the truth of this matter, Nick. I could have told you myself, but you needed to figure it out yourself to grow as a person, Flitwick said with a wide smile. 266. Chapter 266. Not going to lie, that sounded cringy as hell, Nick said with a chuckle, and Flitwick laughed. I suppose it did, but that's just the way of things, I suppose, the small man said sagely. Nick's group all just rolled their eyes at this and went back to what they were doing. Nick, on the other hand, chose to start up a genuine conversation with the professor. That reminds me, for whatever reason, but whatever happened to that idea of yours to get some crafting classes set up? He asked while conjuring up a few chairs for them to sit down on. Flitwick sat down on the short chair Nick had conjured for him and sighed. Hogwarts simply doesn't have the funds to hire the teachers nor supply the materials needed for practice, so the idea fell flat the moment I presented it to Albus, unfortunately, the half-goblin said with a disappointed expression. Nick frowned. Is Hogwarts's finances really that bad? Don't get me wrong, I very much understand that it is costly to fund novices learning craftsmanship, but Hogwarts is the school of witchcraft and wizardry. The school should have more funding than it knows what to do with at this point, Nick said in disbelief. I wholeheartedly agree with you, but sadly the truth is that the school's finances are truly that bad. The decades-long curse on the Dada position has forced Albus to spend more and more money hiring a new teacher each year, and it has unfortunately added up to this wretched state we find ourselves in, the charm's master said honestly. Nick smiled. So if that curse were gone and a large fortune were to be injected into the school, those classes would become possible, correct? He asked with a glint in his eyes. Wick was taken back by this question, but knew better than to dismiss it as a thing of curiosity. In theory, that is correct, yes. Why? He asked curiously. Because just yesterday, I helped the headmaster remove that curse, so all that is left would be the funds, and I know just how to get them, Nick said with a wide grin. This statement left everyone in the room who was listening to the conversation speechless. Truly? Flitwick asked in disbelief. Nick scoffed. Why would I lie about such a thing? You can ask either Dumbledore and Snape about it, as they were both there for the matter, and so long as you mention I told you about it, they should verify the matter for you. he said honestly. Flitwick wasted no time at all and excitedly left the room after that, likely to do exactly as Nick suggested. How do you plan to get the funding, though? Daphne asked curiously, since, as a pure-blooded heir to an ancient family, she was well aware that it wasn't so easy to convince wizarding families to part with wealth if it doesn't directly benefit themselves. It certainly didn't help that Dumbledore could not ask for money from them himself, since many of these same families really didn't like him, and some even hated him. That's the beauty of it. I won't need to lift a single finger after sending one letter. Nick said proudly, leaving her confused. To who? Ron asked, also curious about this. Nicola's flame. Nick said with a wide grin, and all of his friends realized exactly how this could work. They remembered the information on Nicola's flame vividly after the fiasco from last year, so they knew that the man may as well treat gold like dirt, since he could easily make more. It would be a simple matter to the great alchemist to secretly give a small fortune to the school without anyone knowing. But Dumbledore said that Nicholas Flamel and his wife will die before the start of this year after the stone was destroyed. Harry said, confused. Nick laughed at this, which confused everyone until he eventually stopped and explained himself. I don't know what's funnier, that you think something as powerful as the Philosopher's Stone could be so easily destroyed, or that that man would actually die in such a manner, he said with a smile. The Philosopher's Stone can transmute materials flawlessly and even extend one's lifespan near indefinitely, and that's just the stuff that is publicly known about. Something like that can be many things, but fragile is certainly not one of them. What you broke last year was undoubtedly a fake used as bait to draw out Voldemort. So obviously the actual stone's creator is merely using his favorite trick and playing dead. He has already done something similar 7 times already, including this one. Nick said, leaving his friends dumbfounded. 267. Chapter 267. Nicola's Flammel Parv. Things had been quiet for the last few months after I faked my wife Perinell and I's deaths once again. It never ceased to amaze me how easily the vast majority of people accepted our deaths despite our record of faking it. I had contemplated actually dying several times over my long life, but honestly speaking, I couldn't accept leaving with so much left that I didn't understand. I was one of the few people aware of the being called death after having seen it personally. Yes, I had met death before, and what I learned from it confused me. Despite its Dementor-esque visage, it couldn't be further from the foul creatures in what it was. The death that visited me so long ago was nothing more than the spiritual projection of some other being made manifest. I didn't know this at the time, of course, since I hadn't yet reached the astral realm in alchemy yet, and as such was quite unfamiliar with spiritual magics. The astral realm was a strange place that didn't exist in the physical plane exactly, but rather sat just outside it. Curiously, though, it could only be accessed via crafting skill for some reason. While it was possible to physically enter the astral realm with one's body, it was very stressful as the place was highly spiritual in nature, and as such rejected living things. It was the very same spiritual nature that had allowed me to gain enough understanding of souls to identify the false nature of death. It was frighteningly powerful for starters, and old. So very old it was like all of history rested upon its shoulders. And that was just what I observed of the mere projection sent by that being, which was chilling to say the least. I had looked for whoever it was that accessed the astral realm last year, but had failed to discover any trace of them this entire time. In the end, I simply chalked it up to some accidental occurrence on a random craftsman's part and stopped looking. Albus was still search for the fellow, though, since he hoped to ally with them, since they were apparently within England somewhere. The fake stone destroyed in that school last year was merely a magical energy storage gem that I had made to imitate the real thing on Albus's behalf. I was also not very concerned about that misguided man running around causing trouble all over the place either. Truthfully speaking, the only reason I had even gotten involved in the previous conflict with him was that he threatened my home in Paris. While it was regrettable that he was taking so many lives, I had seen a single Muggle war take multiple times more before many times in my long life, and as such ignored it. That said, I did investigate the reason for why he even needed so many sacrifices, and was quite shocked at what I learned. Unlike Albus, and most others who weren't skilled enough to recreate the temporal remnant of an event, I was. Once I replayed the event of the sacrifice, I discovered that in fact each town sacrificed was nothing more than fuel for a grand array ritual all over the globe. The goal of that ritual was none other than to increase the ambient magic levels globally to an unheard of level that had even my heart beating in excitement. It was a clever loophole in the agreement he had made over 50 years ago, as his plan had nothing to do with muggles in truth, but was using them purely as a means to his end goal. I could easily predict how the world would change following this grand ritual being completed, and had to applaud how he accomplished his previous goal indirectly using this method. Magical energy interferes with more complex forms of technology than simple machines, and as such all the weapons capable of truly threatening wizarding society, such as those atomic bombs, will cease to function entirely. In fact, the Muggles' very way of life would get forcefully sent back to nearly 6 centuries or so technology-wise. I had no reason to stop this change either, as both Perenelle and I had long since found the way to elevate our power to the next level, but couldn't take that step due to insufficient magical energy. Simply being so close to taking that step had left our bodies weak and frail, as we struggled to sustain ourselves, much less grow stronger. Today was especially interesting for me, however, as curiously enough, I received a letter. It was a simple thing, really, with no hidden enchantments or even fancy packaging. The fascinating part, however, was that it was delivered by the phoenix that accompanied Albus most of the time, and yet wasn't from him. 268. Chapter 268. Flamel Pav. The name of the sender was one I knew, but wasn't personally acquainted with, despite how amusing the owner of it seemed to be. Albus had, of course, told me of the student that was giving him the most stress, since he popped up out of nowhere, Nicholas Ravenclaw. A monstrous genius in almost every regard that seemed to be involved in several important affairs, both secretly or directly. I was quite interested in meeting this young man after hearing about his self-created enchanting method and rapidly growing skill in crafting. Interestingly enough, the young man seems to have chosen the hardest, but most beneficial form of growth, in that he did not choose to learn in a specialized manner, but in every regard. Veritology, charms, metallurgy, enchanting, and most recently even spent a few days learning from the merfolk in the Black Lake. From what Albus said in his letters, the lad was insatiable in his pursuit of knowledge, no matter how obscure. I couldn't help but feel a bit happy when Albus had told me of the lad's great proclivity for illusion magics. It was an underutilized branch of the arcane, and as such had been stagnant for quite some time. I had very little doubt that the young lad would eventually dip his toes into alchemy as well, since he clearly had a talent for the stuff, like most gifted in transfiguration. Opening the simple parchment letter with a smile, I read the contents held within it. Once I was done, I set the letter down and stroked my chin in thought over what it said. It seems this lad has seen through my little death act easily. Surprisingly, the lad has even asked for my aid in favor of the school in his first letter. On one hand, his request was indeed easy to accommodate for myself, while on the other I know how loath Albus is to ask my aid in this matter. Perhaps it is for the best that I follow the lad's idea and donate a small sum of wealth into the school via proxy, so that I still remain anonymous. I do wonder what sort of face Albus will make after getting this small fortune. Ah, perhaps I should take a trip to the English Isle to visit this young man myself. Parv End. Obviously Nick had in fact written up a letter and had it sent to the Grand Alchemist by the only creature on the planet that could track him down. See, the man was very clever and made it impossible to send him letters via owl, as the birds instead went straight to a drop-off location that he checked for mail regularly. He had stopped, however, in order to play the part of dead man, semi-convincingly. This meant that one needed to either personally track the man down or get the services of Fox to get a hold of the alchemist in hiding. The first option was hopeless, considering the man had over 600 years of experience and power under his belt, so trying to forcefully find him was a fool's errand. For most people, getting Fox's help delivering a letter was right on the same level of difficulty, with how prideful he was. Nick, however, was a very different matter, since he was the lord of all birds, including phoenixes. All he needed to do was ask, and Fox happily took the letter to the alchemist under Dumbledore's speechless gaze. Nick hadn't asked or anything to use the phoenix, but walked into the office and handed over the letter nonchalantly. I admit you have me rather envious of your gift with birds. Did you know it took me no less than 10 years to get him to agree to deliver letters for me? The old man asked with a sigh. Nick shrugged. I didn't expect to get this wand either, but since I did, I see no reason why I shouldn't use the gifts it's given me. He said casually. It is certainly a useful ability to have, if nothing else. Lemon drop, the headmaster offered. Don't mind if I do, Nick said while grabbing one of the yellow candies from the bowl. Dumbledore chuckled. You may be surprised to learn that few actually accept that offer, he said with a small smile. Understandable, really, but as a student I have guessed right while here. You could not offer me poisoned food any more than you could attack me, so I have nothing to fear, Nick said with a shrug. So few even seem to understand that, sadly, though I am curious how you are familiar with guest right, the old man asked, interested. Nick shrugged. Helena thought I should be familiar with magical etiquette, he said honestly. 269. Chapter 269. Nick left the headmaster shortly after that and spent the rest of the day slowly teaching his friends what he could. While most were slowly familiarizing themselves with crafting, Harry and Luna were exposed to the terror that was Nick in duels. He might not agree with most of the man's ideas, but the dueling club Lockhart would have eventually created was an excellent one. Since neither of them will learn a craft, then I may as well train them up to fight. That was his thought on the matter. Neither of the two got any mercy from him either, as he regularly destroyed them in the duels. They were fast learners, however, so they improved rapidly under the pressure he exerted on them. Expelliarmus, stupefy. Harry and Luna cast spells at the same time in the area Nick set aside in the workshop to hold these mock fights. Nick saw the two spells and casually flicked his wand, Pratigo, Fumos. He spoke firmly, and a thick circular barrier blocked the two spells before vanishing as a cloud of black smoke filled the area they were standing in. While their vision was obscured, he moved quickly, tapping his wand against the ground. The floor rose and fell like water. Eep, Luna called out, as she clearly fell over from the unbalanced moving floor. Nick locked onto her location based on that sound in Vorto, he said, and the spell shot through the smoke and struck Luna as she was trying to get up. She stopped trying immediately as her perception of gravity was flipped, and Harry sent a stunner at Nick through the smoke that Nick caught with his wand tip and returned at double the strength. Match, he called out and cleared away the smoke. Harry was knocked out on the floor, and Luna was hugging the ground like she was afraid to fall to the ceiling. Finite, re-innovate, Nick said, waking Harry up and returning Luna's perception to normal. Bloody hell, Nick, do you always have to be so rough? Harry complained, and Luna nodded in agreement. You'll thank me for it later, Nick said with a chuckle. And what about the shield charm? Why haven't you taught us that yet? Luna asked, clearly upset at his showing said spell off. Because you don't have enough magic to use it in a duel. Even if you somehow pulled it off, you would be drained afterwards, Nick said with a smile, ruffling her hair since he knew she hated that. She hissed at him while swatting away his hand much like a cat would, much to his amusement. You can use it, though, Harry pointed out with a small smile at Luna's antics. I also have more magic than both of you combined, so my point still stands, Nick said before going to check on Hermione and Daphne's progress with runes. This is too long, and this is too short, and this is the letter instead of E like it should be. He pointed out the flaws in Hermione's work before frowning at Daphne's. What did I say about sentence chains? They are vertical instead of horizontal. By flipping them, you need to adjust the angles slightly. Also this, and this are all wrong. He scolded, and then proceeded to show her the correct way to write the same sentence. He moved on to Ron after that, who was still stuck on identifying the magical from non-magical varieties of wood. Remember that magical woods tend to look more vibrant than non-magical ones, he said helpfully. Tracy didn't have any issues at the moment, so Nick didn't bother her, as she worked to memorize the various metallurgic facts he had given her. There was no point in her touching a single tool if she couldn't tell the difference between a swage block and hardy tool. Conjuring up and chair, Nick went back to carving Daedric runes to continue to familiarize himself with them. He didn't run any magic through the runic chains in his trial objects until he was in the designated testing area after the whole blood fountain incident. He finally completed his attempt, creating a water conjuring ring after the 8th try, since the previous 7 tries didn't go so great. Still, he got points from the system for them, as well as when he traded them in for more points. None of them were higher than uncommon rank-wise, but points were points, so he didn't complain. What sort of runes are you even working on anyways, since I have never seen anything like that before? Hermione asked curiously after catching a glimpse of the Daedric runes. Demonic runes is probably the closest answer I can give that you would understand, Nick said casually. 270. Chapter 270. Are you using those then? Hermione exclaimed in horror. The language itself is highly conductive for magic, and so long as I avoid certain phrases, run no risk of bringing any member of said race here. In other words, it's perfectly safe so long as I'm careful. Nick said with a shrug. That's not what I mean. Isn't that dark magic? Hermione pressed worriedly. It's just a language, so it's not inherently evil, just like how Latin is used for many dark spells, and yet isn't banned. There is nothing inherently evil about it, relax. Nick said reassuringly. Where would you even find something like demonic runes to begin with? Ron asked curiously. I got it over the summer from a bookshop with a surprisingly large variety of books to choose from. Nick said honestly while snickering to himself at the inside joke. Daphne frowned, however, when he said this, as she had been up and down Diagon Alley with her parents since she was little and had never seen a bookstore like that. Sure, most of the ones in the alley had a wide selection, but save a few obscure books, most of them had the same things. What's it called? She asked, suspicious of what he said. It's a secret. After all, I don't want you sending your families to clear out all those rare and useful tomes should you find it. Nick said with a grin. Daphne didn't want to accept that answer, but she could tell that he was very serious about keeping his source secret. He may be grinning and joking around, but his body language showed how he tensed up when questioned about his source. Having such a strong body meant that his reactions were far more pronounced than normal. I think it would be better if you avoided those runes, or at the least had a professor present to make sure nothing strange happened. Hermione said, still very concerned about the jagged runes he was carving. Nick just waved off her concern, though, since even if something miraculously went wrong, none of the professors would be able to handle it either. For example, if he somehow summoned a Dremora, they would pretty much all be fucked, since those things were legitimately immortal and stupid powerful. That reminds me, for whatever reason, but since Daedra reform in the waters of oblivion, and if I killed one in this world, would they go back to oblivion or somewhere else? He pondered seriously. Hermione still kept nagging at Nick for the next couple days about the Daedric runes, much to his irritation. It was already bad enough to him that he couldn't forge since he was still recovering and didn't want to risk further damage to himself. Madame Pomfrey's prediction that his energy level would be temporarily reduced was also proven true. Nick had found that his mana was only at the level of a 5th-year student during this time, which relieved him a bit since it forced him to limit himself to that level of spell work. Time passed by in a flash as he fell into the schedule and his own teaching and training, and Halloween was today. Admittedly, he simply stopped making rapid progress in his self-improvement once he hit the core work for the 4th year, as it took a leap forward in complexity. He was still quite ahead of Hermione, that was almost halfway through the 3rd year syllabus, but the gap wasn't nearly as wide as he was used to. Surprisingly enough, during this time, Luna actually succeeded in petting Dusk without Nick needing to save her. She had been slowly desensitizing the bird to her close proximity by giving him treats typically in the form of bacon or sausage. Finally, in the 2nd week of October, she accidentally touched him while giving him a treat. She then slowly started to accidentally touch him more and more until she finally got what she wanted and could freely stroke him on the chest. Dusk knew what she was doing, of course, but let his gluttony get the best of him. There was a nip in the air when Nick woke up today, and he bundled up a bit more than normal as a result. Fall had truly started to hit in full effect as the plants around the castle were wilting and or dying. This was great news as far as he was concerned, since it included the plants in herbology that were lethargic and much easier to deal with for him. Nick had thought about making a ring to improve his ability to deal with the plants, but honestly had no idea where to start, since talent was not exactly something properly defined. 271. Chapter 271. Without a basis by which to build the enchantment, he would only have the weakest possible enchantment, which was simply not worth it in his opinion. One would assume that Hagrid's gifted ring that made him closer to nature would count, but it simply did not work on plants. In fact, the ring simply made Hagrid ever so slightly more in tune with the wildlife nearby. As a result, Nick resigned himself to remain vigilant against the plants during herbology lessons. Leaving the dorm room at his normal time, Nick was surprised to see the twins up and about. They were dressed in tattered robes and had on realistic masks that made them look like zombies. The masks were clearly enchanted to fit snugly and move with one's facial expressions to truly give off the effect of a true undead. "Looking good, boys. I'm sure you'll scare up a storm," Nick said as he walked out into the common room. "You don't look very scared to me," Fred said with rotten teeth and a maggot crawling out of his cheek. Nick scoffed. "The glamour enchantment might work on most people, but I regularly use illusion spells, so it is barely acceptable in my opinion," he said honestly. "Oh yeah, we'd like to see you do better then," George challenged with a raised eyebrow. Nick grinned and drew his wand before pointing its tip at himself. "Lupi Vita." He spoke, and an illusion spell flowed over him, but from the fearful and amazed looks of the twins' rotten faces, the spell worked as intended. From the outside perspective, Nick's appearance was replaced with a huge, densely muscular, silver-furred creature that looked like a perfect mix of man and wolf. Unlike actual werewolves that were pale, furless, malformed creatures, this appearance was much fiercer looking. This illusion spell had been created by a wizard a couple hundred years ago, when he, for whatever reason, felt the need to terrorize a village that had marked him. As a result, when Nick moved, the wolf and monster moved in the exact same way, with each contraction of its powerful muscles being visible. Nick slowly walked around the furniture of the common room while staring down the twins like a predator, patiently stalking its prey. Smiling widely, Nick watched the nervous expressions of the twins as they watched him leisurely close the distance. He stopped in front of them and looked down a little, which had the wolf monster appear to be staring down at them from its high height. "Boo," he said with a grin, and both of the twins gulped in fear. Satisfied, he raised his wand again and pointed it at himself. "Finite," he said, and the illusion faded away like fog in the summer sun. "Good enough?" he asked smugly. "Well, mate, you have got to teach us that spell. I've got goosebumps just thinking about it," Fred said excitedly. "Compared to that, these trinkets aren't worth a single nut." George agreed wholeheartedly with his twin. "No can do, I'm afraid. This is my trick to scare the bejesus out of everyone today. If I taught both of you, it won't work. I've got one for a Dementor, though, if you're willing to do me a bit of a favor," Nick said with a mischievous smile. The twins recognized that look and smiled widely. "What can we do for you, friend?" they asked at the same time, and Nick leaned forward to tell them his plan. A few minutes later, he walked out of the common room with a smirk, while the twins were cackling to themselves. With a single part of his plan in place, Nick quickly moved through the hall towards Flitwick's office to set up another piece of the plan in advance. With no life-threatening or terrible villain in the background for this year, after he had gotten rid of the diary, Nick wanted to still put on a grand performance, as should be tradition at Hogwarts. This required the aid of several different people to pull off perfectly. Once Flitwick's assistance was acquired, Nick went straight to the next person who he needed assistance from. Soon enough the day passed by, and it was dinner time in the castle, and all the preparations had been made. Nick himself was currently sitting on his broom, hidden under disillusionment, alongside Fred and George, on their own brooms within the enchanted sky of the Great Hall, as students started to fill the hall. Dumbledore had already instructed most of the staff not to interfere no matter what happens tonight, so this performance will go down without a hitch. Once everyone was in attendance, Fred and George made their moves as they covered themselves and their brooms in the Dementor illusion, while the great hall's temperature dropped. 272. Chapter 272. The disillusionment spell on them was dispelled slowly, and they seemed to manifest in the great hall's sky, out of nowhere eliciting screams from several students as they slowly flew down and over the heads of the Four's house's students, while making haunting, raspy breathing sounds that the real Dementors were known to have. Dumbledore stood up at this time and spoke. "Be not alarmed, as I shall deal with these creatures," he said dramatically, which caused Nick to roll his eyes as the old man pulls out his wand. "Expecto Patronum." The old man's voice boomed, and from the tip of his wand, a bright white light shot out towards the twins, solidifying into a phoenix along the way. "He is." The twins hissed as if in pain as the Patronus approached them and began to try and fly away from the corporeal spell chaotically. This resulted in a chase of light and dark in the air overhead, much to the students' awe. Eventually, though, the twins saw the signal from Flitwick and flew towards the headmaster as if they were going to fight to the death with him. Flitwick then stood up and pointed at where Nick was flying overhead with his wand, Lupus D. He spoke loudly, while a bright flash of light appeared, which Nick used to appear in his wolfen illusion form. He then stored away his broom and started to fall towards the two twins under the stunned gazes of the entire student body. Nick's illusion self wrapped its claws around the two twins' throats, making it look as though he had captured the two of them, and roared loudly, thanks to a voice-changing potion, like a savage beast. "Rawr!" His voice filled the whole room, raising plenty of goosebumps in the process. Dumbledore then waves his wand, and the Patronus crashed into the twins, exploding in a burst of light while they hissed in pain. Nick opened his mouth wide, and under the horrified gazes of the students, had his illusion self bite down on the heads of both of the twins, who went limp before vanishing in a whirlpool-like manner when they were in fact simply just disillusioned again. Nick raised his head towards the sky and howled in triumph, "Oh!" And while that was happening, McGonagall secretly cast a transfiguration on the ground that made it seem as though Nick's wolf illusion self was turning to stone as he howled. Nick then cancelled his illusion that exact same moment. Flitwick disillusioned him, allowing him to go unnoticed as he slipped away. The entire student body stood up and clapped in amazement and joy as Dumbledore wished everyone a happy Halloween. Nick and the twins had sneaked into the Gryffindor table during this standing ovation with wide smiles. Surprisingly, Dumbledore had went off script and decided to oust the actors of this little show, as well as its mastermind, to everyone here. As much as I would like to take credit for this wonderful entertainment, I am not the mind behind it. I would ask you all to applaud the true stars in this matter, our own Phileas Flitwick, Severus Snape, Minerva McGonagall, and of course myself, in the roles of Dementor Fred and George Weasley. Everyone in the room zeroed in the twins, who bowed with wide smiles as everyone clapped loudly. Finally, in the role of Guardian Wolf, and the mind behind this entire event, Nicholas Ravenclaw. Dumbledore said loudly, and it was Nick's turn to bow and receive a standing ovation. After that, it was finally time for the feast that was just as grand as last year's Halloween dinner with various pumpkin dishes. "Why didn't you mention that you guys were doing this?" Ron asked Nick, slightly upset at not being included. "And ruin the surprise for everyone, never," Nick said, and the twins at either side of him nodded in agreement. "Besides, these two are natural actors, and you have to admit played the role of Dementor perfectly," he added while patting the twins on the shoulder. "It was brilliant, mate," Harry said with a smile. "I still can't believe you managed to get Snape involved in this whole thing, though," Seamus said from nearby in amazement. Nick shrugged. "It actually wasn't that hard, really. I gave him a bit of a challenge while also properly paying for his time and effort." That voice-changing potion was something he had to come up with on the spot and only just finished before it was time to perform. He said honestly, "Bloody hell, I can't even seem to brew a potion from the book, and he made one out of nowhere?" Ron asked, incredulous. 273. Chapter 273. Nick shook his head. Not exactly brand new, since there are already several potions that can change one's voice. What he had to do instead was use the information from those potions to figure out how to create a potion with the effect you saw previously. Compared to actually making a totally new potion, this is many times easier to do, he explained honestly. It's still really impressive either way, he added seriously. Nick spent the rest of dinner chatting with his housemates about the show he had put on. Without the diary around to open the chamber and sick the basilisk on a cat of all things October ended nice, and quietly minus the monthly sacrifice, of course. Nick felt it, however, when his core finally recovered, as he was suddenly filled with much more energy than he had gotten used to. As a bonus, he also made a breakthrough in his wand, making runes, thanks to him experimenting with Daedric runes in place of the normal ones. The meaning behind the runes was the same as the normal ones, but the effects were multiple times better. The reason for this was, ironically, the affinity Daedric runes had for souls and flesh. To put it simply, the use of Daedric runes, instead of normal ones, made the connection between wand and user much tighter than normal, which increased the efficiency of magic use by nearly 3 times as much as a normal wand. Ollivander would sell his left arm if it meant he could learn this information. Nick thought with a chuckle as he stored away the ebony and unicorn hair wand in greed. He had been reading up on space magic over the last month when he wasn't busy with his friends or normal schoolwork. Unfortunately, that subject was extremely advanced, and he had made absolutely zero progress in learning it. The reason for this was simply the fact that the stuff was heavily built upon arithmancy, which Helena refused to teach him for some reason. Oh, he had definitely asked several times, but she always avoided the subject somehow. The worst part, in his opinion, was that she never explained why she didn't want to teach him the subject. Left with little option, he was forced to try and figure it out himself via the books in the library. This was honestly speaking horribly inefficient for him, as all the books recorded was the rules and a few equations for various deductions. Normally this would be enough for, say, spell crafting and general easy predictions like who will sit where. The trouble came in the form of permutation and additional variables in the situation that each had their own rules and equations. Arithmancy could in theory predict literally everything that could happen or will eventually happen if one took every possible conclusion and variable into account. This was what it meant to be omniscient, in fact, to know all things at all times. Unfortunately, reaching such a state was impossible for limited minds, such as Nick's. The closest a limited mind could get was the ability to divine the future. That was actually what set seers apart from advanced arithmancers. Seers peered directly at the results of an impossibly large number of events happening simultaneously. Arithmancers instead deduced the step-by-step process of reaching an outcome which was in fact way harder. Obviously, Nick wasn't trying to reach that point, since there was honestly no point in doing so for him. Despite this, it was still stupidly hard to get the hang of even simple arithmetic predictions. Today was a Saturday, however, and Nick had plans that involved killing a very large and very old snake. He had prepared for this by transfiguring 5 of Hagrid's roosters into marbles that he kept in his pocket. He had also brought Dusk along to the second-floor girls' bathroom as a distraction for the basilisk, since the bird was immune to the instant kill effect of its eyes. The bathroom was fairly well maintained despite the fact it was unused due to the last victim of the basilisk, Moaning Myrtle. She was a 14-year-old when she was killed for discovering the Chamber of Secrets and had twin-tailed brown hair, bad acne, and glasses. This appearance had remained after her death until today as she haunted the bathroom where she was killed. She very rarely left the bathroom, which was what made the events of the second year originally improbable. Since she rarely left the bathroom and couldn't be killed again since she was a ghost, so she would definitely have known about the possessed Ginny opening the chamber the entire year. Getting revenge on the person who killed her would definitely be something she would do with her spiteful personality. 274. Chapter 274. Myrtle's bathroom was rather primitive, all things considered, as the toilets and sinks were very primitive in functionality. The sinks were obviously an original part of the castle, since they were basically magical water basins, like those in his own manor on Ravenclaw Island. The toilets, however, were definitely added on latter, since the founder's time didn't have them. Nick wasn't here for an architecture tour, though, and ignored most of the bathroom. "Come to mock poor helpless little Myrtle, have you?" A feminine voice spoke up mockingly from nearby. Nick turned to look at the source of this sound and wasn't surprised to see the ghost haunting this bathroom, acting like she was sitting on the stall walls. "Not at all, Myrtle. I am merely here to use a secret passage hidden in this room," Nick said with a smile. Clearly his reaction to her sudden appearance caught her off guard, as she went silent for a bit before snorting and leaving with a silver blush on her ghostly face. People like Myrtle were easy to deal with thanks to their almost paranoid levels of self-depreciation that made them very uncomfortable when spoken to kindly or with respect. It's sad that merely acting like a decent person was enough to make such people flee, but Nick couldn't do anything to fix that, so he ignored it. Finally alone, Nick slipped on his parcel-tongue ring and walked over to the circular sinks. "Open." He spoke with authority, and the sinks magically started to move in order to reveal a wide, long pipe that he couldn't see the bottom of. Removing the parcel-tongue ring, Nick points at his feet with his chest. "Aranarum pedis." He speaks, and a blue streak hits his chest. Carefully placing his foot flat on the vertical surface of the pipe, he takes a deep breath and leans into the foot. Normally, he would immediately start falling if he did this, but thanks to the spider walking charm, he now stood on a vertical surface like gravity was not a factor. He was slightly nervous taking that first step, but since the spell was working as per usual, he smiled and started to jog down the pipe. Thanks to his strong body and incredible stamina, he had no problem at all jogging for the entire hour it took for him to finally reach the chamber's true entrance. There were bones of various kinds all over the ground, as well as a large amount of white powder that he recognized as bone dust. On top of all of that was a huge green snake skin that shone faintly in his magical senses. Nick walked over to the skin and ran his hands along its scales that were smooth and sharp like push daggers. Unlike most snakes that didn't actually shed their hides, the basilisk was clearly different, as this snake skin was no different from natural leather. It still held some of the natural magic of the beast, as well, making it very valuable for crafting. Nick folded the 80-foot-long shed-up by tapping it with his wand, before storing it away in greed after transfiguring it into a small block of wood. He didn't have enough room in greed to keep it full-sized after all. Once that was collected, he walked forward, ignoring the crunching of bones underfoot, as he found the large metal door with various snakes carved on it, alongside incredibly enough parcel-tongue runes. They looked like a bunch of squiggles meant for decoration, but were in fact an actual written language. The words written on the metal door spelled out, "Here stands the chamber of the great Salazar Slytherin, greatest of the Hogwarts Four." Nick snorted at this egotistical sentence, more like most notorious of the four, he thought, before putting the parcel-tongue ring back on and commanding the door to open. The metal serpents retracted their heads one by one before the metal door swung open on its own. Well, at the very least, the man knew how to make his enchantments last, if nothing else. He admitted as he stepped into the true chamber of secrets. It was cold and dirty, but plenty of signs of its previous glory remained, as there were serpent statues lining the walls, and burning green Gabrathian flames cast light through the entire massive room. There was a stone walkway leading to a deep pool of water that sat under a massive stone face that was obviously Slytherin himself. On either side of the walkway were deep pits filled with water as well. Other than this, however, the room was fairly empty, as there was nothing else within sight. Nick acted like he didn't notice the massive magical creature starting to move behind the statue's face as he walked into the chamber. 275. Chapter 275. Tap, tap, tap. Nick's footsteps echoed throughout the chamber as he walked along the path towards the statue at its end. Once he reached the edge of the pool of water, he tapped his wand on its surface lightly. Immediately, the water began to transform into ice as he transfigured a huge volume of water all at once, draining a decent chunk of his mana in the process. Large-scale transfigurations like this always took a huge amount of skill and power to accomplish, but Nick succeeded in basically sealing the chamber in thick ice, so the basilisk can't flee into the water. Once that was done, Nick took out several marbles before looking straight at the face of the statue that had ominous and murderous ramblings coming from behind it as the basilisk waited impatiently for him to release it. "Speak to me, Slytherin." He spoke in a long string of hisses, and the mouth of the statue began to open. Immediately, Nick retreated backwards and conjured a massive amount of smoke to obstruct his vision of the basilisk with the Fumo spell. This was proven wise, as the beast slithered out of the statue's mouth head first before loudly and angrily hissing when it noticed that he wasn't the master of it. Dusk flew off of Nick's shoulder and through the smoke before beginning its part of the plan and distracting the giant snake. Nick tapped on the ground, and the stone rippled and transformed into chains that rapidly wrapped around the body of the king of serpents. He was using his magical senses to accomplish this since his vision was impaired. 1,000-year-old basilisk shone much brighter in them than even Dumbledore did, so he could easily tell nearly every detail of its body without seeing it. Its body was, of course, that of a giant snake, but there was a big difference in its head in the form of long antler-like horns with sharp points. This was what gave the basilisk its name as the King of Serpents, its crown. Nick's transfigured chains worked a charm to bind the giant snake as it tried to struggle against them angrily, but he had transfigured the metal to be adamantium, so it was a pointless effort. Once he was confident that it was well and truly bound, he smashed the marbles containing the roosters on the ground, turning them back into their bird state. Immediately, they all began to crow at the same time, which caused the chamber to get very loud with the sound. The basilisk screamed in pain and violently thrashed about in an attempt to flee the crowing of the roosters, but failed to free itself. It did succeed in breaking a couple of links of the chains, though which was more than enough to show its crazy strength before it eventually fell over dead with blood streaming out from between its scales and eyes. The smell such blood had filled the entire chamber, making Nick grimace. Still, he ignored the roosters that were constantly screaming and quickly transfigured a cloth over the basilisk's head to make sure it didn't accidentally kill him with whatever power remained in its eyes. He then cleared away the smoke, allowing him to truly see the beast fully. It had vibrant emerald green scales and a length of nearly 90 feet, with a diameter nearly identical to that of a wine barrel at 7 feet across. The head was still covered with the cloth, but the sharp horns and almost draconic features under the cloth were visible thanks to how form-fitting it was. Mana was slowly leaving the body, proving it was truly dead, but Nick thought it a waste to let the monster's soul dissipate and pulled out the Nazgul ring and threw it at the corpse. Until all the magic in the body left, the soul will remain in the body, which is how ghosts can be formed, since the magic in their bodies can force them into that state before it dissipates. The ring landed on one of the horns and began to glow as it ate the soul of the beast. Something was different this time, however, as the glow of the ring wasn't pure white and gold like it was after eating a Horcrux, but rather had an emerald tint to it. Nick frowned at this, but he could feel from the wavelength of the ring that the ring considered it good for him. Nick hesitated slightly, but steeled his resolve to take the risk after remembering the threat of Zeus that could come after him at any time. He made sure to be clear that he only wanted the green energy at the moment before he picked up the ring from the corpse. 276. Chapter 276. The Nazgul ring kept back the huge amount of energy from the basilisk's soul, but injected the green energy into Nick by itself the moment he touched it. He stiffened while preparing to reject the energy or deal with extreme pain, but it sank into his soul seamlessly. Nothing happened at all, and it confused Nick greatly. Channeling his spiritual energy, he saw that his soul was completely the same, except a small bit of emerald green in it. That small amount of emerald didn't seem to do anything at all, so he chose to ignore it for now. Storing away the Nazgul ring that was currently like a sun in his magical senses in greed, he turned his attention back to the massive and extremely valuable corpse in front of him. Lifting the cloth up slightly, Nick tapped the first eye of the body, transfiguring it into a marble that he removed from the bloody socket. Ignoring the blood on his hand, he walks to the opposite side and repeats this process, at which time he banishes the cloth since the eyes were taken care of. Nick spent a moment to marvel at how amazing the beast was in its full glory before prying its mouth open with magic. Once open, Nick pulled out 2 large enchanted crystal flasks from greed and carefully placed them under the venomous long fang's sharp tips. He secured them in place with the sticking charm before pressing his bloody hand against the roof of the mouth and pushing. Immediately, yellow-green liquid started to pour out of the fangs, in large amounts filling the flasks. Normal crystal flasks would have already dissolved under the venom of a basilisk, but these had been specially enchanted to be immune to the corrosion. Once the two head-sized flasks were nearly full, Nick unstuck them and corked them with enchanted crystal corks before storing them away. That was all of the venom of the basilisk, which was stupid expensive per drop normally. Nick then carefully extracted the fangs that he put in greed as well before closing the mouth of the corpse. He had a bit of a dilemma at that point, as there was honestly not a single part of the basilisk that wasn't a treasure, but he simply couldn't take everything at this moment, as greed's space was simply not big enough. "Darty!" he called out, and with a loud pop, the house elf appeared in the chamber. "Ara!" Darty screamed in surprise and terror at the massive dead snake covered in blood nearby once the surroundings were taken in. Nick honestly didn't blame the house elf, since even a dead basilisk like this one was a terrifying thing indeed. "I need you to take the body back to the manor and put it in stasis until I ask for it," Nick said seriously, and Darty looked reluctant to touch the body, but did as commanded. If the beast was still alive, this would be impossible for a single house elf like Darty, but with the beast dead it wasn't an issue. Dismissing the chains that held the body down, Nick tapped the blood puddle with his wand, which caused it to all gather up and condense into a large red orb that he stored away in greed. Not missing a step, he walked over to the still open mouth of the statue and into it. His ability to see in the dark came in handy in this regard, as he could still see the path forward. Mission conditions established. Description: you have defeated the dreadful monster of the Chamber of Secrets, and to the victor the spoils. Objectives: explore the chamber fully, claim the treasures within optional, hidden optional rewards. 2x item ticket, 1000 XRP optional. 1x material ticket, optional status. Incomplete. This new mission popped up in front of Nick, and after reading through it, he frowned since he really didn't like that one of the objectives was hidden. The reward for it was easily more valuable than any other the others, which meant that it was also likely much harder to accomplish. "I'll try my best, but not going to stress over it," he decided as he followed the dirty path. Soon enough, he came across a large room filled with bones and long decayed snake skin. This was definitely the nest of the basilisk, but there must be something else here, or the mission wouldn't say it. He thought seriously. Looking around the large room carefully, Nick finally found the hint he needed in the form of a very small snake statue in the corner. It had an arched back that made it obvious that it was a handle of some sort. 277. Chapter 277. Nick gripped the handle and pulled, but nothing happened, so he instead tried to twist it left or right, and that did something. Pish! The sound of pressurized air getting released came out, and Nick retreated cautiously. Click! A loud click echoed through the room before a small hatch popped up out of the ground with the handle on its top. Nick carefully pulled the hatch open and was surprised to see that it was a stairway leading deeper underground. Cautiously, he started down the stairs while leaving the hatch open behind him. He squinted when a torch suddenly lit up at the bottom of the stairs, revealing a small collection of books, artifacts, and materials. Clearly this was a sort of vault that Slytherin had used to hoard away his valuables. "So I get a new visitor out of the blue, judging from the commotion above you are no descendant of mine," a rough old voice said, and Nick froze. Turning to look at the source of the voice, Nick was surprised to see a portrait with a very lifelike visage of Slytherin in it that was calmly examining him. "I wasn't expecting to find a living portrait of you here of all things," Nick admitted honestly. Salazar's portrait raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Oh ho. Parcel-tongued it would seem. No wonder you could get into the chamber," the portrait said with a look of understanding. Nick hurriedly removed the parcel-tongue ring on his finger that he had forgotten about. He would have noticed sooner had it not been for the fact that as something magically bound to his bloodline, Darty had access to some of its abilities, which included his all-speak. As a result, the house elf thought he was speaking English when in fact it was parcel-tongue. "Sorry about that. I don't have very good control over that ability at the moment," Nick said awkwardly. "It's fine since it took me nearly a decade to fully master it myself. I envy you to have a tool to make the process easier," the portrait said with a sigh. It should probably go without saying considering where you are, but I am Salazar Slytherin, Archmage and Healer. The portrait then said proudly. Nicholas Ravenclaw, student and crafter. Nick returned the introduction. Ha! Rowena would be rolling in her grave if she knew that a descendant of hers was a parcel-tongue. The portrait laughed and spoke mockingly. Nick didn't feel like correcting the man and explaining that he actually spoke all languages. Still, it's a bit troublesome for one of her descendants to reach this room when my own failed to find it 50 years ago. I couldn't by chance convince you to leave this place empty-handed, could I? The portrait asked hopefully. Hang on, Voldemort failed to find this room 50 years ago. Nick asked, surprised to learn it. Yeah, the brat took one look at the room above and decided that it was merely Herma's nest alone, the portrait said with a disappointed expression. Nick found it rather funny that Voldemort missed out on all this treasure just because the room above was a huge mess. I suppose you plan to take everything in here, huh? The portrait asked calmly. If it makes you feel better, I can leave a copy of the books. Nick offered. How's about a trade instead? One question for you to leave one thing of my choosing behind. The portrait counter-offered. Nick shook his head. Why would I do that when your bloodline is all but extinct in the Isle? He asked seriously. The portrait frowned. What do you mean? It asked, not believing Nick at all. There was originally 3 members with your bloodline, alive 70 years ago, but after the only daughter of the family, Merope, died in childbirth to a Muggle's child, there was only 3 again. That child grew up and killed off the other descendants of yours, becoming the only one, and soon enough he too will die without an heir, thus ending your direct line. Nick explained calmly. The portrait looked distraught. Is there no way to save the last member of my bloodline until they can sire an heir? It asked sternly. Nick shook his head. He does not even have a body at the moment, and is merely a spectre bound to the earth via Horcruxes. Those are being systematically destroyed, so he will soon be forcefully sent to the afterlife. He explained generously. Nick had no reason at all to lie to a mere portrait without any power to act on its own. That said, it didn't mean he was going to tell it that he was the one cutting away the last remnant of its likeness's bloodline. 278. Chapter 278. Why would he create Horcruxes? Surely not to extend his lifespan, since he should only be about 60 or 70 at the moment, the portrait said with a frown. I can answer that question, actually. His greatest fear is death. The idea that no matter how powerful he gets, all it takes is a single mistake for all of his effort to be rendered void terrifies him. So he split his soul into, at the moment, 6 Horcruxes that he hid away to try and be unkillable. Nick explained, and the portrait sighed. I can't exactly fault him for such a fear, as it is perfectly natural, but the way he accomplished it is simply dreadful. To use that old fool Herpo's flawed method to stave off death will only lead to madness, the portrait said with a look of disgust. Wait a moment, you said flawed method to describe the Horcruxes, which implies a perfect method existed. Nick pointed out with a very concerned look. How could he not be concerned when even Horcruxes were a pain in the ass to deal with, and they were highly flawed? A perfected version of that same sort of magic would definitely be way harder to destroy. You've been sincere enough, so I suppose I can tell you about that subject. You see, after old Herpo lost his Horcrux and had his power crippled, he sought a way to recover and even perfect his creation in his madness, and he succeeded. Unfortunately, the perfect method required one to have a complete soul, and his was fractured and missing a part, which allowed us to kill him and take his knowledge and treasures for ourselves. Rowena took a strange tree and a few books in ancient or unknown tongues. I took the staff of Asclepius and his research on basilisks. That fool Godric took the tomes of combat magic and magical swordsmanship. Helga, on the other hand, was more than happy to take all of his wealth instead. All of us agreed to destroy the perfected method he created, however, as it was beyond twisted and sacrilegious. Did you know that that madman thought that binding one's entire soul to an item and existing as a mere projected body was a good idea? Dreadful stuff, even by my standards, and I am no saint, as you probably know, the portrait said seriously. Nick racked his brain when he heard the name Asclepius, as it sounded very familiar, and then he figured it out and was shocked. Asclepius was the god of medicine according to Greek mythology, and his staff was very likely to be a genuine divine artifact. Nick didn't find it strange that Salazar would have taken such an artifact, since the staff was said to have a serpent permanently coiled around it and fit his affinity for the creatures perfectly. Looking around the room, Nick frowned when he didn't see the staff anywhere amongst the treasures. The portrait scoffed when it saw this. Did you think I would leave a literal divine artifact behind when I was chased out of the castle? Everything here is merely that which I no longer had a use for but was too valuable to trade away. Don't look down on these things, though they were nearly unheard of even in my time, much less 1,000 years later. The portrait said arrogantly. You probably know where your likeness took the staff, don't you? Nick asked sternly. The portrait tutted at him, however. Now why would I tell you that when you have no relation to me at all? It asked mockingly. It was abundantly clear that the portrait throwing a parodied version of Nick's own words earlier back in his face. Nick realized that the portrait was merely stringing him along to try and get what it wanted this entire time, and finally chose to ignore it and pack up the loot. The portrait wasn't lying about the rarity of this stuff, either, as Nick couldn't directly identify 90% of it when he was storing it away. The 10% he did recognize were various valuable metals such as star metal, night iron, and even what looked like liquid gold in a bottle, but was a stupidly rare metal known as guard's blood. The reason for the name was that according to myth, when a guard was wounded they bled golden blood. Guard's blood, however, was very much a metal, however, that had nothing to do with guards at all, but rather was the result of a freak magical incident with as little as a 1% chance of happening. The stuff was the best metal for enchanting bar none, and was so valuable and rare that most people didn't even know it existed. 279. Chapter 279. Nick himself wouldn't have known about it had it not been for him seeing it in the system shop at a staggering 8 million points per drop. Looking at the vial of the stuff in his hand, Nick estimated there to be at least 10 drops worth of the stuff in it. This alone makes the trip worth it for me, but the rest of this stuff is just an added bonus. Nick said with a smile, while the portrait was scowling angrily. You probably don't even know what that is, so your attempt at antagonizing me is pointless. The portrait scoffed. God's blood, and to be fair, I normally wouldn't know what it is, but I am a bit special in that regard. The things I can accomplish with this stuff gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. Nick said honestly. He wasn't joking either, since a single drop of this stuff was enough to create enchantments so complicated it may as well have been a runic reconstruction of every gene in a species' DNA. Though the enchanter would need to have the appropriate level of skill to accomplish such a thing to begin with. Tusk, it's not like I can stop you anyway, so fine, take everything, and I hope you choke on your greed, the portrait said angrily. Nick chuckled, but chose to ignore the portrait and focus on removing the curses attached to some of these items. The portrait grew more and more somber as it saw this, since it became clear to it that none of its likenesses trapped items were going to work. One needed to keep in mind that while not as skilled in the art of enchantment as Rowena Ravenclaw, Salazar Slytherin was still extremely skilled at it. Hiding curses from detection was a simple matter for him, and yet Nick was countering and removing the powerful dark curses easily. Are you a seer? How can you remove these curses with so little effort? The portrait couldn't help but ask, as it simply couldn't figure it out. Most seers had some sort of mental peculiarity that made them strange in conversation, yet Nick had none of that. Nick merely smirked while removing yet another curse and storing away the item it was attached to. For people like Salazar, mysteries were maddening things, so Nick's actions were driving the portrait nuts as it racked its mind for an answer. It couldn't come up with a single answer that made sense, however, and as a result could only grit its teeth in frustration. Soon enough, Nick had packed away the various artifacts and materials and was moving on to the books as well. He could only shake his head at the many layers of curses on each of them that he had to strip off one by one. He could understand cautious, but this was getting ridiculous, as there was way more than necessary in place on all this treasure. Amongst the books, there was one that caught his attention, however, that was a journal bound in leather. Flipping it open, Nick was surprised to see that it was nothing less than a step-by-step guide to the perfected method of Horcruxes. Salazar was definitely correct in saying that it was dreadful even by his standards, as unlike the original Horcrux method that merely used murder and a ritual to create a Horcrux, this version burned the souls as fuel to slowly transfer one's own soul fully into an object while leaving a connection to the body. Yeah, souls, as in more than one at a time. Nick was disgusted by this information, as to burn souls in this way was to erase them from existence fully. It was heinous beyond measure, and only someone mad or totally without conscience would be willing to perform it. There is nothing worth knowing within these pages, Nick said, and used his ability to cover the book in his hand in violent flame, reducing it to ashes. I can't blame you for that decision, but that is so wasteful. Do you know how rare soul magic is? The portrait said, slightly regretful at the journal's destruction. Nick snorted and channeled his spiritual energy into his hand, making it glow for a brief instant before he stopped. The portrait had bulging eyes and a gaping mouth after seeing that. I know more about souls than you ever did, so don't talk to me about how rare it is. Nick replied scathingly. Necromancy. No, your spiritual energy was too pure for that. It is something else. The portrait started talking to itself in an attempt to figure out what Nick did. After storing away the last book, Nick turned back to the portrait with a vicious smile. 280. Chapter 280. Now all that's left is to deal with you, Sir Portrait, or should I say Salazar Slytherin, Nick said mockingly, and the portrait took on a cold, arrogant expression. How did you figure me out? The founder asked calmly, but with a slight menacing chill. I told you already, didn't I? I am more knowledgeable about souls than you ever were. That ritual of Herpo the Fowls leaves a permanent taint on the user's soul that anyone sensitive to spiritual energy could spot from miles away. It also didn't help that the magic used to animate portraits wasn't created until about a century after your disappearance from the school, Nick said with a mocking smile. Salazar snorted angrily, and much to Nick's amazement, stepped out of the portrait and stood before him in the flesh. It matters not, I suppose, since you won't be leaving this place alive, Salazar said, as he pulled out a long wand from his robe that Nick recognized as a branch of the golden apple tree in the Ravenclaw vault. At first glance, it looked like Slytherin had full mastery over it, but to Nick's magical senses, it was a very different story. The wand was violently rejecting the Salazar, who had turned himself into little more than a lick at this point, but was being suppressed by the man's massive mana. Oh yes, the founder had the most power out of anything Nick had ever encountered up to this point, and appeared like a blazing sun to his senses. Nick raised his wand, Lumos Miker. He spoke, and Slytherin hissed angrily as Nick blinded him temporarily as an extremely bright burst of light exploded from the tip of Nick's wand. Finite! The founder roared, but looked confused when his blindness didn't go away. Nick smirked and dashed to the side out of the way of a green spell from the founder who silent cast it at his previous position. Nick pulled the Nazgul ring out of greed and tossed it past Slytherin, who had already recovered to a degree, and coldly mocked him for not even being able to aim right. Nick grinned viciously. Your projection isn't the target, he said, and it took the founder all of a split second to go pale and turn back to the portrait in a panic. No, he yelled angrily as the ring struck the portrait and immediately wrapped itself around it and went to work. Ah! He started screaming in agony as his projection began to unravel as his soul was being devoured by the ring. Nick watched on coldly as this happened, since he had been planning this moment since he discovered the true nature of the portrait. See, originally, he had thought it was merely a cursed artifact, that the actual founder left behind that was wrong somehow. But after reading the process of the perfected Horcruxes, he figured out what was wrong with it. It was a phylactery for Salazar Slytherin himself. From that moment on, he started to set a trap for Slytherin to force him to use his projection, leaving his phylactery unprotected. Salazar Slytherin had nothing to blame for having his phylactery destroyed other than his own arrogance. Much like the diary Soul Shard, he had underestimated Nick far too much and paid the ultimate price for it. He couldn't be blamed, though, since from the looks of things Nick had cheated to a large degree in order to kill the basilisk. Tying it down and have multiple roosters crow at the same time didn't really take much skill in magic after all. Unlike with the Horcruxes, it took quite a long time for the phylactery to be destroyed by the Nazgul ring, since it contained a complete soul. Some might think that this victory should have been impossible given Slytherin's power and experience, but in truth, the man made several mistakes that lead to this outcome. The first was already mentioned, as his arrogance led to him underestimating Nick. The second was that his projection couldn't leave the painting for very long, as the ambient mana simply wasn't enough to support his existence. This meant that by placing his phylactery in such a location, he had grown very rusty over the last 1,000 years, since there was no new knowledge available to learn. He had effectively trapped himself in the Chamber of Secrets until someone came along able to take his phylactery out. The third and final mistake he made was not considering that with his knowledge of souls, Nick might have had a way to destroy his phylactery. All of these mistakes together had led to Salazar Slytherin meeting his end after 1,000 years at the hands of a second-year student. 281. Chapter 281. Finally, the projection fully vanished, as the ring devoured the final hints of the founder's soul, causing the portrait to turn to dust. Behind that portrait was another room that not only contained the staff, but also a miniature library of clearly hand-written books. Checking a handful of them, Nick's eyes lit up as he found that they were all written by Slytherin himself to record his entire set of knowledge. They were so detailed that there was even entire tomes that no longer existed copied down verbatim in some books. This library may as well be a step-by-step guide to becoming as powerful as the founder himself. Nick thought with a wide grin. He chose to temporarily ignore the library, however, and focused on the old wooden staff that was carved to look like it had an actual serpent coiled around it. The serpent was so masterfully carved that other than age-related signs on the wood, Nick would have been convinced that it was an actual snake otherwise. His magical senses, however, were nearly blinded looking at the thing, as it was covered in dense, complex enchantments via a style he was totally unfamiliar with. At first glance, it looked almost like the Celebrimber method of enchanting, in that the enchantments had been fused throughout the entire staff, both inside and out. But there was no spiritual energy or intent involved, meaning it was totally different. It was fascinating to say the least, as he couldn't make heads or tails of the enchantments. The only reason he hadn't gotten a nosebleed of some sort like he had when looking at the Hogwarts ward stone was that, unlike that object of power, the staff's enchantments flowed together smoothly rather than just sitting on top of the others discordantly. The difference was like listening to a fine-tuned orchestra versus a huge group of people all talking over each other. One was easy on the senses, and the other stressed them considerably to try and decipher. Wub, wub, wub. A pulsing sound drew Nick out of his thoughts, however, and looking at its source, he saw the Nazgul ring's glow pulsing in a rhythm. What's going on? He thought, confused as to what was happening. Soon the pulsing glow grew more and more intense, and cracks began to appear on the ring, and Nick's eyes widened when he picked up a magical reaction around the glow. Magical beast birth phenomena, he thought, dumbfounded at what he was seeing before his very eyes. Nick had assumed that the ring would eventually gain a form of pseudo-life like the Elder Wand but he had never thought it would become an actual magical creature instead. While his brain was occupied with the significance of this event, the metal of the ring finally shattered. The shards didn't fly everywhere, however, but instead grew larger and turned into liquid that rapidly formed a metal shell around the raw glowing energy. Thump, 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 thump. The sound of a heartbeat echoed throughout the area, and Nick felt the hair all over his body stand on end, as the magical beast birth phenomena grew far more powerful than even when Norberta was born. Clearly, whatever the Nazgul ring was turning into was of a higher life order than even a dragon, which made sense. Dragons were highly magical, but whatever the ring was becoming was born of pure, unadulterated spiritual mana that had reached a critical point. Nick frowned, however, when he felt the life signs of the ring start to weaken, and he realized it had been over-eager and didn't have enough energy to be born anew. Walking over to the metal shell, the size of a basketball, he gently rested his hand on it and began to channel his spiritual energy into the egg. Slowly but surely, the life signs grew stronger and stronger with this new infusion of spiritual energy, until something changed, and Nick felt a connection form between his soul and the thing the ring was becoming. Carol! Crack! A loud bird call came from the egg, and a single crack appeared on it as bright light began to pour out from within it. Soon Nick watched as more and more cracks formed on the egg, until with a loud boom, the egg exploded, and the bright light temporarily blinded Nick. Once Nick's vision had returned, he saw the new magical creature standing before him and sucked in a breath of air in awe. It was a bird that had a body shape much like that of an eagle, except much smaller and narrower. It was covered in smooth, shimmering black, white, and golden feathers from head to tail. 282. Chapter 282. It had two sets of wings, much like a thunder bird, that were folded against its body at the moment, and four clawed bird feet that gave the form a griffin-like feel. That was where the avian features ended, however, as it had a long serpentine tail at the end of its body, covered in feathers, but ending in a familiar circular metallic ring. It also had a short neck that ended in a basilisk-like head that included the sharp horns, except that its mouth had a beak at the end. It was honestly one of the most eerily beautiful creatures Nick had ever seen. It was only the size of a house cat, though, so it wasn't very intimidating at all, and Nick had no idea how big it was going to get. Chirp! Nazgul trilled happily as it started walking around clumsily, clearly not used to its new form. How in Merlin's saggy beard am I supposed to explain you? Nick asked out loud while looking at the clumsy creature. Nazgul quirked its head adorably at the question in confusion before ignoring Nick. He was at a loss as to what to do, however, since he couldn't exactly hide Nazgul away due to his familiar bond to it. Unlike owning an owl or cat, in which case they could be away from their owners for long periods of time, and true familiar bond, like that which Nick had with Nazgul, meant it would be very bad for its health to be separated from him. This was also the reason that Fox is usually never far from Dumbledore for very long. When Nick willingly gave Nazgul his energy to complete its transformation, he had been familiar bonded to it, and now they were bound together on a spiritual level. Nick could only sigh and seal up Slytherin's library for later use, since this took priority. Once the library was sealed, he walked over to the newborn and scooped it up into his hands. Nazgul didn't resist, but rather snuggled up with a yawn, and immediately went to sleep with its tail wrapped around Nick's arm. Dusk, who was flying about the chamber outside the statue's mouth, landed on the ground near Nick, but was shivering in fear as it looked at Nazgul. It took Nick a few seconds to realize why Dusk was terrified of Nazgul. See, each of the immortal bird species would always be reborn after they died, either from old age or from being killed. However, if Nazgul still possessed the ability to devour souls, then there would be nothing to be reborn, should it kill an immortal bird, as that immortal bird would lose its very soul. Such a thing was likely instinctively terrifying as far as an immortal bird like Dusk was concerned. At this point, Nazgul may as well embody the truest form of death possible, soul death. Calm down, mate. She won't hurt you, I promise. Nick said reassuringly, and Dusk relaxed a little, but still refused to get near Nazgul at all. Helpless Nick could only leave the Chamber of Secrets with Dusk following behind at a distance. As it turned out, it required yet another few miles of walking on the long pipe's wall to get out again. Moaning Myrtle took one look at Nazgul in Nick's arms and noped out of the bathroom immediately. Dusk immediately flew away once they left the chamber entirely, likely in an attempt to put as much distance between him and the sleeping Nazgul as possible without leaving the castle. Nick got more than a few of his fellow students, mostly girls, approach him to pet Nazgul, who didn't seem to mind the attention at all, while Nick himself was mentally sweating buckets. The small, soft, adorable creature in his arms could kill souls, so if she decided she didn't like a particular student for whatever reason, yeah, bad stuff. Still, despite waking up mid-transit to Dumbledore's office, Nazgul seemed perfectly content to get carried around and petted like a pampered cat. Still, Nick made it to the gargoyle statue of the headmaster's office without any issue. Sherbet Lemon, he spoke, and the statue moved aside. Dumbledore was surprised to see Nick so spontaneously, but Moment Fox saw Nazgul, he stiffened in fear, which the old wizard noticed through his bond with the bird. To his surprise, the elder wand in his sleeve also seemed terrified of the creature being held in one of his students' arms. I feel like you have quite the story to tell me in regards to that creature you are holding, the old wizard said with a small chuckle to try and hide the uneasiness he felt at the fear that those two extremely powerful things held towards whatever that creature was. 283. Chapter 283. You can both relax. She isn't likely to harm either of you, Nick said both to Dumbledore and Fawkes. The headmaster chose to trust Nick on this and relaxed visibly, while the phoenix looked much less like it believed him, though it did calm down considerably. Lord of Birds, or not, he was holding what may as well be the Grim Reaper in his arms, so caution was well warranted. Nick took a seat across from Dumbledore and rested Nazgul on his lap, which she immediately sprawled out on leisurely, which made her seem totally innocent and peaceful. I'm going to be blunt here. I have almost no idea what she is despite being familiar bound to her. I know what she was and how she was born, but I am at a loss as to what she is now beside terrifying, Nick said without sugar coating anything at all. He then lifted up the end of Nazgul's tail to show the headmaster the ring at the end of it. For the first time, Nick had ever seen Dumbledore's eyes widened, and his mouth gaped open in shock. Nick couldn't exactly blame the man, considering he basically just said he totally created a brand new life form. Nick decided to break down the process by which Nazgul turned into her current form from the beginning until now, without revealing the fact he had been feeding her soul pieces and most recently whole souls. Instead, he said she was merely accumulating more and more energy until she got enough to turn into her current form, which wasn't wrong. Dumbledore had a very serious expression by the end of Nick's explanation, while Fawkes seemed to have calmed down mostly. I believe you. However, this is a very serious matter, as it is very illegal to attempt to create new creatures, he said sternly. With that said, it is clear that you had never intended for this outcome, and are thus not going to get punished after this gets reported to the Ministry. Nick sighed in relief, since he really didn't want to go on the run due to Nazgul's accidental birth. Matter of it being familiar bonded to you complicates matters a bit, but I am sure that after a small probationary period, you will have no trouble keeping it with you. Dumbledore laid it out seriously, but kindly. She, Nick corrected, and Dumbledore chuckled. She it is then. You wouldn't happen to know any abilities she may have that might be good to know for the report, do you? He asked, and Nick shook his head. Honestly speaking, I have an idea, but I can't definitively say whether or not they are true, he said helplessly. It was true too, since, until Nazgul showed off any abilities she might have, he honestly wouldn't know. Even the ability to eat souls might have changed in some manner, he had no idea. System appraisal also didn't work on animals, so that idea was out. Dumbledore didn't seem surprised to hear this at all, since it was not unusual for new species to have unknown abilities. If that's all, I expect you ought to go introduce the little one to your friends, the old man said, and sent Nick out of the office. Looking over to Fawkes, he sighed. You couldn't by chance tell me what was so dangerous about that little thing, could you? He asked, and the reply he got back was a single concept, an idea if you would, death. Nick, on the other hand, was once again walking through the halls with Nazgul in his arms comfortably. It didn't take long for him to get to the workshop that was unlocked and occupied by his little group. Luna immediately lit up and rushed over forcefully, interrupting her duel with Harry the moment she saw Nazgul. Dusk was also in the room, but was hiding behind the furnace nervously. Hello, aren't you just the cutest thing ever? Yes, you are, Luna said, while snatching Nazgul out of Nick's hands and giving her a spinning hug. I only took the other girls a heartbeat after that to follow suit and shower the newborn with affection. Nick looked at Steve. Looks like you aren't the cutest thing around me anymore, mate, he said with a chuckle, and Steve just looked confused. Anyone else going to notice out that the angry bird looks terrified of whatever that is? Ron pointed out how freaked out Dusk was of Nazgul. That got everyone's attention as they looked, and indeed Dusk was cowering away from the newborn fearfully. Now that you mention it, what even is this anyways? Tracy asked, confused. She is Nazgul, and she is my familiar. As for species, it doesn't have a name since she is the first of her kind. Nick said while taking a seat to relax. 284. Chapter 284. You know it's illegal to create new animals, right? Daphne asked with a small amount of worry. The law says it's illegal to do it on purpose, whereas she was about as accidental as it gets. That reminds me for whatever reason, but don't make her mad, or she might eat your soul. Nick said casually while all of his friends stiffened. Why am I not surprised that a creature you made, accidental or not, can eat souls of all things? Tracy asked with a sigh. To be fair, I'm not 100% certain on that ability, since she had it as a ring, but as she is now, there's no telling what she's capable of. Nick said with a shrug. He had long since accepted that his life was going to be strange beyond belief, so he was starting to get desensitized to crazy shit happening around him. Clearly, his friends were right there next to him, as they recovered from the shock of learning that the adorable monster they were cuddling could probably eat souls in a heartbeat. So basically she looks all cute and stuff, but is probably ridiculously dangerous, Daphne asked for verification purposes. Yeah, that about summarizes it nicely. As a plus, though, she seems too lazy to try and hurt people. Nick said with closed eyes. You know Hagrid's gonna lose his mind when he sees her. Man thought a dragon was cute even after it set his beard on fire. Ron said, exasperated. I wonder if I should tell him about Aragog. Now no need to make him avoid Hagrid over something deep in the forest. Nick thought to himself with a chuckle. Zap! A loud sound like a small spark of electricity going off filled the air, and Nick felt a sudden weight on his lap. Opening his eyes, he was left speechless as Luna was sitting on his lap with a confused expression with Nazgul in her arms. What just happened? Nick asked, confused. She teleported in a bright flash of lightning. Harry said with wide eyes. Elemental teleportation, huh? That's handy. Nick said honestly. Luna slid off of his lap and complained, Why are you so hard? She said while rubbing her backside. Nick nearly choked on his tongue when she said this, as his thoughts immediately went to a lewd place. Cough asterisk, I have a lot of muscle, he said with a bit of a blush. Nazgul wiggled out of Luna's arms and flapped her wings a few times to move through the air and crash into Nick's lap hard. He winced in pain at that, but chuckled and scratched her on the top of the head. Need to work on your landing, little one, or I'm going to have a lot of bruises, he said with a chuckle. Luna looked heartbroken to be left by Nazgul, but chose to grab Steve instead. The hefty Niffler was perfectly okay with that too. It took a while, but Dusk slowly grew more comfortable with Nazgul after seeing she genuinely had no interest in him. No, she was far more interested in taking a nap with Nick on his reclining chair than anything else. Rather than continuing to bother Nick, his friends went back to what they were doing when he arrived earlier. For most, the sound of crafting and dueling would be loud and impossible to sleep through, but for Nick, it was a wonderful symphony lulling him to rest. He got shook awake a couple hours later by Harry since it was dinner time. Standing up with a yawn, Nick moved Nazgul into his left arm and left the workshop for the Great Hall. Dusk sat on one of his shoulders, while the fat Steve stood on the other, making Nick look like he had too many creatures. Steve and Dusk were things everyone was used to seeing, but Nazgul drew quite a bit of attention. Nick sat at the table in plain view of the entire Great Hall, where she, much like the other two magical beasts, ravaged the food on the long table. Nick was, of course, doing his damage to the food as well, but the beasts had him beat hands down. Hagrid at the professor's table looked like he wanted nothing more than to charge over and examine Nazgul in detail, while most of the other teachers had exasperated looks. It was bad enough having to deal with a ho-ho and a niffler, but now they whatever this thing was as well. Still, there was nothing they could do about it, as the ho-ho had a bad temper making it untouchable, and the niffler was practically adored by the majority of the female population in the castle. This new thing, though, was apparently familiar bound to Nick, so they absolutely couldn't do anything to it. Familiars were sacred things in wizarding culture, so acting against them would have the entire community breathing down one's neck. 285. Chapter 285. Nick spent the next few days dealing with the bureaucratic nightmare that was registering a new species, verifying his familiar status with Nazgul, having interviews with several over eager Magi zoology papers, receiving hundreds of letters requesting the privilege to study Nazgul from various different wizards globally, and then all his schoolwork as well. Needless to say, he was mentally exhausted by the time the weekend came again. He had discovered a few new things about Nazgul's magical abilities over the last week, as well as she occasionally showed off something new. The first thing he verified was that she does still eat souls, though the energy doesn't get passed to him afterwards. Instead, she stores it within her body to fuel both her growth and another magical ability. Nick had been steadily feeding her the souls of insects, fish, toads, and rats to help her stock up on energy since he discovered this. Obviously, those souls didn't give a lot of energy, but it was better than nothing in his opinion. Still, all that energy let her grow considerably, so Nazgul is currently the size of a medium-sized dog breed like a Shiba. Nick had also discovered that she had an innate ability to freely manipulate spiritual energy in a manner nearly identical to the way he himself does. The biggest difference was that she was leagues better at it than he was with a 100% efficiency compared to his roughly 73% efficiency. Nick was more than a little jealous, to say the least, but chose to swallow his jealousy. She also had an ability that he identified its source immediately due to its uniqueness. She could kill or petrify with a single look if she wanted to, as Nick had learned when she killed a feral rat with the ability. The ability was thankfully active instead of passive like in the case of the basilisk, so she had full control over it. The most valuable magical ability, though in Nick's opinion, was a type of fire she could create using her stores of spiritual energy. According to the system, it was known as purgatory fire, and was one of the only 3 spiritual flames in existence besides hell fire and holy fire. The system shop had a seed of the stuff listed at a staggering 50 billion points, making it stupid expensive. Despite that, however, he couldn't cheat and feed a seed to the system for a bunch of points, as the system refused to take it. Still, he wasn't too upset about it, since he could simply add it to his furnace and use it for his forging, which he did. Other than that, he hadn't seen any other magical abilities from Nazgul other than that. Peeves, on the other hand, learned the hard way that pranking her was a bad idea and was now terrified of her. Despite being immortal and thus unkillable via most methods, Nazgul directly attacked his ghostly body and tore his essence apart. He regenerated after a couple days, but the memory of the pain it brought him was enough to make the poltergeist give Nick's group a very wide berth. Nick hadn't forgotten the previous attack on Dusk, but had been far too busy to focus on Peeves, so this worked out great. There was no point in killing the poltergeist anyways, as another would be created by the end of the year due to the chaotic energy of the student population. Waking up on Saturday after sleeping in a bit, Nick got dressed and woke up Nazgul as well. She yawned and stretched out on the bed that she insisted she sleep in before walking next to Nick as he left the dorm. Today was the opening match of the Quidditch season at Hogwarts between Gryffindor and Slytherin, so Nick and his friends were going to cheer Harry on. "You slept in rather late today, it seems," Hermione noted as he walked into the common room. "It's been an exhausting week, and I needed the sleep," Nick said with a shrug. "Just remember not to get lazy like the Ron or Harry," she said sternly. "Yawn. We aren't lazy, classes are just boring is all," Ron said with a tired yawn as he and Harry came down from the boys' dorm stairway. "He's not wrong, you know. I mean, look at how much effort he puts into woodworking. He's quickly catching up to me, and I was taught by Ollivander himself," Nick said, taking Ron's side. Hermione huffed, but didn't argue since Nick was right about how much progress Ron was making. The only real trouble Ron was having at the moment was getting the runes and wand opening charm down. 286. Chapter 286. Once he gets past that point, though, Ron was basically already set to make wands on his own. "So how confident are you in winning against Slytherin with their whole team outfitted with new brooms?" Nick asked Harry casually. "My Nimbus is only slightly worse than the new model they have, so I can keep up with Malfoy, but the rest of the team is a problem. I'll be rough on them, to be honest," Harry said seriously. "I imagine it will be, but we know for a fact that Gryffindor teams trained much harder than the Slytherin thanks to Daphne and Tracy," Nick pointed out, and Harry nodded in agreement. Oliver Wood had gone absolutely nuts on training this year after tryouts, so the entire team was in peak shape for the game. It wasn't known outside the Gryffindor team, but the twins had been making money hand over fist selling the workout potions to the team. This meant that the whole team had far more bang for their buck for all that intense training they did. This was going to be a very nasty surprise for the Slytherin team, who was only slightly in shape, since schoolwork took up most of their time. The group made their way over to the Great Hall and ate breakfast, before heading over to the pitch, where Harry left them for the locker room. It was a slightly cloudy day, with a bit of a chill in the air that had them bundle up with scarves. When the bowls were released at the start of the game, Nick frowned as he felt a foreign magic latch onto one of the bludgers that then targeted Harry. Why is he still causing trouble? The chamber is not a threat anymore, he thought before excusing himself from the pitch to track down Darby. The elf wasn't hard to find at all, as he was manipulating the bludger from under one of the empty bleachers nearby. Sneaking up on the hyper-focused elf, Nick pointed his wand at Darby's back from up close. Stupefy, he said, and Darby didn't have any time to react before it was lights out. Using his magical senses, Nick quickly found the slave binding to the Malfoy family, thanks to Draco being nearby, and directly cut it off, freeing Darby. Countering magic was easy when Nick had time to feel it out, since he just needed to send a pulse of opposite frequency magic at it, and this was no different. Renervate, he spoke calmly, and Darby immediately regained consciousness, but seemed in disbelief almost immediately afterwards. Yes, I freed you. Now explain why you are still attacking Harry, even though I have already gotten rid of the diary and the monster in the Chamber of Secrets, Nick asked sternly. The book is gone, and the monster, Darby questioned with wide, disbelieving eyes. Nick rolled his eyes. If you had bothered to check, you would already know about the diary being taken care of, meaning Lucius's plan had already failed, he said impatiently. How does Sir know of these things? Darby asked, horribly confused. I know about the diary because the foolish thing tried to attack me, and as for Lucius's involvement, simple deduction really. Anything else, or is that enough to satisfy you? Nick asked in irritation. It would have taken Darby maybe 2 seconds tops to check on Ginny and see that the diary was completely inert, yet had instead stubbornly tried to get Harry out of Hogwarts again. He had good intentions, but it still irritated Nick to no end that he needed to set the elf right. Once that nonsense was dealt with, Nick returned to the rest of his friends, just in time to see Fred and George making themselves nuisances with the bludgers. Thanks to their great bodies, they had developed a strategy that involved volleying the balls between them and flying an opponent into the crossfire. Harry didn't even get the chance to catch the snitch, since the twins crippled both the Slytherin team's chasers, ending the game with Gryffindor's victory. It was a rule that the game ended when no one could fill a position on a team due to injury. Was it frowned upon to win like that? Yep. Did the twins care? Not even a little. Oliver Wood didn't care either, since they had won, but the Slytherin captain, Marcus Flint, was beyond furious and even almost started throwing curses. Seeing as the game was over, Nick snatched the snitch out of the air with a thread of fire before handing it over to Madame Hooch to put away. Oliver Wood looked like he died a little inside when he saw that, while Marcus Flint felt relief that Nick wasn't playing against them. 287. Chapter 287. Dumbledore Parv. I had hoped that over time Nick would slowly mellow out and not cause so many problems, but that simply hadn't happened. Not exactly how I had hoped anyways, as he did indeed become less reserved, and now spent a great deal of time amongst those he calls friends, but he was arrogant in how he seemed to view the world now. The sort of prideful and vengeful attitude I would expect from a phoenix or ho-ho, in fact. He isn't unkind or anything like that, but he simply ignores anyone outside his circle. Add on his rapidly improving prowess in magic, and the boy is rapidly shaping up in a very familiar manner to myself when I was younger. Thankfully, unlike my younger self, he has a fairly clear moral code and refuses to cross some lines. The imprint on the school's ward stone was proof enough of this. If he dabbled in dark magic in the pursuit of power like I did when I was younger, the dark would taint his imprint to some degree, and yet there was nothing, not a single drop. I was both eager and worried about what the future under him will look like as a result. Everything that made Gellert and I great was found in the boy, but there was also negative points as well. He was charismatic, powerful, attractive, and skilled in magic, but he was also proud, ambitious, and burdensomely gifted with many magical abilities. The last one doesn't seem like a negative point, but people grow the most under pressure, and with so many abilities at his beck, and Call the boy can casually coast his way to glory. He simply can't find the pressure needed to grow as an individual. This was why I was surprised to learn that he was teaching his friends his knowledge. It was out of character. The boy was many things, but charitable was definitely not one of them, and yet I can't figure out why he was suddenly deciding to do this. It was almost as if he was suddenly subjected to an extremely heavy pressure and was trying his hardest to adapt. The thought that he may have figured out what Gellert's sacrifices were for crossed my mind, but I had only barely discovered their purpose myself, after much effort. In the end, I decided to just accept this good news and focus on the newest headache Nick had given me. Just this morning, I had received a letter from Gringotts telling me that one Herald Rich had donated a staggering 200,000 galleons to Hogwarts for class expenses and wages. This act had Nico's fingerprints all over it, and I quickly pieced together why he had done this as well. It's not a common thing to have someone come into my office and have Fox personally deliver a letter to Nico after all. Yes, the boy hadn't even tried to hide what he was doing from me, but was completely obvious about it. I could only sigh and accept this donation, since as much as I am loath to admit it, the funds were desperately needed. The only other person aware of exactly how close to bankruptcy Hogwarts was is Minerva. She had long been helping me manage the various legal aspects of the school, and thus knew just how badly the Dada curse had sapped away the school's funds. It was for this reason that I had to reject Phileas's proposal for crafting classes beyond the rare alchemy class I teach, if demand is high enough. Now, though the school is totally recovered, thanks to the sudden injection of funds that brought us back to full capacity, I owe it all to that stubborn child who refused to accept lack of funds as an excuse. It was an odd feeling for me to be grateful for one of my own students being a troublesome individual, but here I am. My current greatest concern is not with Nick, but rather Gellert and the repercussions of what he intends to do. It was unpleasant, but I had warned the various ministries of the world what he sought to accomplish not long ago. Few have noticed it, but each ministry is slowly bracing itself for the massive war that the whole world will soon be embroiled in. I used arithmancy to determine the amount of time we have left to stop Gellert, and came to the answer of almost 3 years. If we fail to stop him in that time span, the entire world will be flooded with magic ruining centuries of the Muggles' hard work and ousting wizarding kind from hiding by force. The predicted death toll was a staggering 3.5 billion lives as the Muggles' society collapses and wizards are forced out into the open. 288. Chapter 288. Nick did not know that the secret of Grindelwald's plan had basically been revealed to everyone who needed to know at this point, but he would be happy if he did. In fact, he would be thrilled at that fact, since it would explain why Arthur Weasley had all allegations against him dropped at the Ministry. Nick assumed that it may have been due to the goodwill the Weasley family earned because of the capture of Pettigrew. If he knew about this leak of Grindelwald's plan, however, it would change his thoughts entirely. After all, why would the Ministry punish Arthur for the magical car, when it may be the last functional car on the planet in the next few years? Instead, the Ministry had encouraged Arthur to disclose his car's enchantments so they could secretly try and fill the Muggles' vehicles with them. It wasn't much, but the Ministry hoped it would lower the death toll at least a little. There was one tiny little hiccup in that plan, however, in the form of Arthur not actually knowing the enchantment by heart. See, he had been very secretive when doing the enchantments, and thus didn't write them down, meaning he simply didn't know what they were by heart. It was like writing a long essay for school, and then being asked to recite it verbatim without having it in front of you. Most people would fail at it. This, funnily enough, led to the Ministry trying to track down the vehicle in the Forbidden Forest for the last week. It was only at this point that the Ministry learned the true extent of what all lived within its bounds, after several auras were attacked by various unfriendly creatures, including acromantulas. They found the car, though, and managed to extract it from the forest semi-safely. It didn't show up in the paper, but the whole school was aware of it, since the auras had fled the forest with the car in the middle of the day, making quite the commotion when they did. 3 of them even had to be treated by Madame Pomfrey for acromantula poisoning. Nick knew that the car had gone wild in the forest, but didn't know that it had also decided to take up residence in the acromantula territory. It was only after sneakily eavesdropping on the Aura's conversations that Nick learned why they were after the car. The Ministry wants to replicate the enchantments on the car. Why? The information confused him greatly, as he simply couldn't understand it at all. Even stranger was how, despite the sheer amount of pure bloods in the Ministry, they weren't throwing a huge fit over something as major as this. It was more than a little suspicious, to say the least. Still, he decided it wasn't any of his business what strange ideas the people at the Ministry came up with, and ignored the matter. Instead, he was far more interested in his most recent treasure, the staff of Asclepius. Staff, Snakewood Hydra Heartstring Grade, legendary abilities, poison synthesis, poison immunity, parcel tongue, healing affinity, hag's blessing, mana focus, medicine domain mythical ability, healer's blessing. Once a day, the wielder can return an unhealthy person to peak health regardless of the severity of their injuries or diseases. Legendary ability, life restoration. Once every 10 years, a single person below the Tier 2 power level can be brought back to life so long as they have been dead no longer than 3 days. Needless to say, Nick was very interested in the staff after seeing this appraisal from the system. It certainly lived up to the hype of being a divine item. How could it not when it literally allowed someone to be resurrected with fairly easy-to-fulfill requirements? The staff also perfectly fit the description of Asclepius, perfectly with all of its abilities. With poison synthesis, one could on the spot generate any sort of medicine by diluting the poison to a helpful level. The fact that the staff also gave Parseltongue fit, since according to mythology, the god learned from a snake the secrets of the medicinal arts. Nick had also finally learned what grade was past mythical thanks to this staff, so he knew what he needed to shoot for now. Till now, he hadn't made a single mythical item because he didn't know how exactly, but after comparing this staff with his wand that was mythical, he had a rough idea. Mythical items were actually not much different from high-end rare-grade items, except one difference: the ability. In order to be classified as a mythical item, the thing needed to both have a certain level of complexity as well as a single transcendent ability that doesn't necessarily need to be related to the other normal abilities. 289. Chapter 289. With this information, Nick intended to create his first mythical item, but he didn't want to half-ass it and get a barely good enough product. With that in mind, he knew exactly what his first mythical ring was going to be, since it had been bothering him for quite some time now. He was going to create a far better version of greed that was all around improved. It wouldn't even be all that hard to accomplish either, since the original greed enchantment has a vast amount of room for improvement. Nick had several very large pieces of metal sitting in front of him that he needed to melt down to form the new greed's base form. Mithril, adamantium, orichalcum, goblin silver, god's blood, star metal, water bronze, fire gold, cloud iron, and timanium. In this selection was a few of the metals he retrieved from Slytherin's hoard in the Chamber of Secrets. With them added in, Nick included all 4 base elements, as well as both space and time, and even painstakingly chose to part with a drop of God's blood to push the enchantment to its absolute limit, according to his ability. Nick had waited until after he was dismissed from class on Friday and locked himself in the workshop with Helena and Flitwick, because he will need both of their help for this particular venture. He had taken into consideration how long it would take him to complete this ring, and including resting to replenish his energy, it will take no less than 2.5 days. Helena and Flitwick's role during this time was to ensure that the enchantment never stabilized as he restored his energy. If it ever did, he would be forced to start over again, ruining all his previous work. Flitwick and Helena were both informed of this, and thus were extremely serious as they waited for Nick to begin. First he cranked on the furnace and switched it over to conjunction fire, since greed was always meant to be a storage space first and foremost. Nick then started to place each and every metal in the furnace to melt. The metal in the furnace boiled and rumbled before every type of metal finally liquefied, and Nick wasted no time throwing the single drop of Guard's blood into the mixture and pointing his wand at it. Ruaimnia Kanana Goyana Nua. He spoke, and glowing gold, white and green mist sank into the liquid metal from the tip of his wand. The liquid began to swirl violently in the center, and soon the various colors of the different metals fused together before vanishing. Nick hurriedly removed this new metal liquid from the furnace and sent it into a large mold he had prepared beforehand. It was an open-face mold in the shape of a huge ring, so it contained the roughly gallon of liquid metal without issue. While they waited for the metal to solidify, Nick turned off the furnace and took out a whole loaf of Lember's bread. Nick ate the entire thing after the metal showed signs of turning solid and stood tall as he closely watched the mold. His stomach began to hurt a bit from the dense amount of nutrients within the loaf of bread, but he ignored it since the metal had cooled into shape. He removed the mold using transfiguration and placed the glowing black metal ring on his anvil. He switched over to his hammer and began to channel his spiritual energy with the intent and knowledge of greed's enchantment, but far stronger and more in-depth. He poured all his knowledge of boggarts, space, time, and the world into his spiritual energy and slammed his hammer down onto the black ring. Boom! A loud shockwave of energy exploded from the ring in a rainbow light, but passed harmlessly through everything. The black ring morphed immediately into the ring-like but amorphous visage that greed normally had. Nick wasn't surprised, considering he had injected majority of his energy into this single step of the process. Helena took the first shift, keeping the ring's enchantment unstable, while Nick sat down and meditated to restore his energy faster. 2 hours later, when he finished, he stood up and approached the anvil again whilst holding his hammer. This time he began to channel his energy with the intent of fire and the roles it plays in the world. His glow turned red and violent like the element he was imbuing into it before he struck the ever-shifting ring the moment Helena removed her influence on it. Na runya Yuruloki Anna. Fire, flames, volcano, sun. He spoke, and the energy radiating off of him seemed to gain actual substance as a wave of heat rose from him and dried out the air of the workshop. 290. Chapter 290. Helena turned incorporeal to escape from the intense heat, while Flitwick started to sweat heavily, but refused to tear his eyes away from the spectacle before him. Nick raised his hammer, and for the briefest moment, both Flitwick and Helena had the illusion that the sun itself had manifested on the head of it before Nick struck the ever-changing ring. In an instant, the scorching heat vanished, as Nick sent most of his energy into the ring yet again. Flitwick took the next shift in keeping the enchantment unstable, while Nick soundlessly sat down to meditate again. After 2.5 hours, he recovered his energy and stood up to move on to the next part of the enchantment. This time, when he started to channel his energy, both Helena and Flitwick braced themselves for whatever insane phenomena he manifested next. Nen tuin ir Ross Helka, water, river, ocean, rain, ice. He spoke firmly, and the energy around him turned azure while heavy and flowing like the various forms of water he was channeling. This time the room grew horribly humid and sticky as the concentration of water in the air shot up. Once again, the phenomena vanished when Nick brought down his hammer. Nick's body started to ache horribly as the strain of this intense forging started to take its toll on it. From an outside perspective, it seemed as though he had only swung his hammer 3 times so far, but in each of those swings, he imbued the vast majority of his energy before resting the bare minimum amount of time needed to recover. Such an action puts an incredible strain on his body, leaving him sore at the moment, but he wasn't not even halfway done yet. Sitting down, Nick sips a bit of Wiggenweld potion to ease the strain on his body before meditating. While this was going on, a single person outside the workshop knew that an incredible amount of energy was being thrown into this forging session. Dumbledore was quite connected to the wards of the school as the headmaster, and as such the fluctuations of power from the workshop were transmitted from this connection. He was not surprised about this, however, as Nick and Flitwick had already warned him that they would be unavailable for the next 3 days due to an intense crafting session. I wonder what sort of amazing thing will come out of that room this time, he thought with a small amount of excitement. Nick's meditation was taking longer and longer the more he used it to restore his energy, as this time it took 4 hours for him to recover fully. This is the last part for today, since I will need true rest after this, he said seriously, and both of his helpers nodded in understanding. Channeling his energy once again, Nick closed his eyes and fully calmed himself before he started to speak. Amble Litsi Oronti Nor. Stone Sand Mountain Land, he said firmly, and the energy immediately turned hard and brown, while the phenomena this time was far more oppressive than the previous two. For both Helena and Flitwick, it was as if they had been buried alive as the air pressed on them from all directions. It vanished just as soon as it came, however, as they watched, and fell into the illusion of a grand mountain being held in Nick's hand as he brought the hammer down. Like that they were done for the day, with the exception of Helena, who, as the only one not needing sleep, was in charge of keeping the enchantment unstable. Nick wasted no time at all conjuring a bed for himself in the workshop and falling onto it. Sleep overtook him immediately as his exhaustion, both physical, spiritual, and mental, was paid its due. He awoke 9 hours later, refreshed in all regards and ready to continue the forging process. Much like himself, Flitwick had also conjured a bed in the workshop to rest in, but had long been awake, since his goblin blood meant he only needed about 4 hours of sleep to properly function. Helena was herself resting in a way, as she had taken her incorporeal form, as hours of constant magic use had left her a bit drained. Nick got up out of the bed and didn't even bother removing it, since he would simply use it again in a few hours. I should be able to finish the foundational work today, and then it is time for the really hard part, he said seriously, and both of his helper nodded in understanding. He channeled his energy as he walked over to the anvil, and soon he began to speak as he gripped his hammer rest upon it. Gwelu Shore H. Wester Hero. Air, wind, breath, storm, he said firmly, and the energy seemed to become formless and invisible, yet an intense gale swept through the room, pushing against Helena and Flitwick. 291. Chapter 291. Once again, the illusion of the greatest embodiment of wind came to them in the form of a mighty hurricane held in Nick's hand. Unlike previously, there was a change in the large, constantly shifting ring when he imbued this part of the enchantment into it. The ring began to violently change shape into each of the elements in a manner that made both Helena and Flitwick nervous. Nick was calm, however, as he had expected this might happen once all 4 elements were fully added to the ring. At the moment they were clashing, as they worked out a sort of balance between them as they would in nature. It didn't take long for the clash to end, as the elements settled into an uneasy balance. At that point, Flitwick took over in keeping the enchantment unstable while Nick meditated. Use ardor in the next part of the enchantment. The result may surprise you. Celebrimber spoke up from the mindscape in a mysterious manner before going quiet again. Nick fell deep into thought at what was said, however, as he hadn't even thought of using that word due to its meaning. Ardor was a word that held great weight in the language, as it meant realm or bounded region. This referred to all of known creation that was made by the Aina, that were basically angels created by Eru Iluvata, basically God. It wasn't hard to imagine the sort of thing that would come about as a result of adding this word to the enchantment. While it was true that Nick intended to create a small pocket dimension within the ring which he was slowly setting up, he had never thought to try and create a realm of all things. Such a thing steps dangerously close to the act of an angel or demon in terms of significance. The worst part was that he was sorely tempted to do it just to see if he could in fact pull it off. He knew that it would obviously be a very small realm, even if he succeeded, but a realm was a realm regardless. Once his meditation was over, a couple hours later, he stood again and took a deep breath before calling upon his energy once more. Talam Elen Luster Menel Arda. Space Star Void Heaven Realm, he spoke, and the world shuddered as space itself seemed to harden and condense around Nick. Veins popped out as Nick strained against the pressure of this understanding and power, and the hammer slowly fell before gently tapping the ring, But that was enough. The power flowed into the unfinished ring, and it violently expanded and contracted as it grew terribly unstable. "Quickly, bind it to your soul," Celebrimber urged with clear panic in his voice. Nick grit his teeth and bit his thumb to draw blood that he then infused with all but the tiniest spark of his spiritual essence. The brightly glowing drop of blood flew out and sank into the ring. Nick's vision faded as the lack of energy forced his mind to shut down, and he had the strangest dream. He found himself floating in the blackest void with no body and no stars, or anything else for that matter. Then he felt a change as a strange voice he didn't know started singing in a strange way that had no words but contained great meaning. From this song came the stars, the sun and moon, and a small spherical object made of stone. As the song continued, more and more stones appeared and violently crashed into the first, making the shape bigger and bigger. Then the song shifted tone and water appeared and rained down upon the uneven sphere of stone, creating lakes and rivers, with some great and others small. The song changed yet again, and suddenly the void was no longer empty, but filled with some invisible something. Air was created. This air gathered around the sphere and was held in place by some fundamental force, and Nick watched as the sun heated the water that then rose into the air and formed the first cloud that then wept upon the sphere in rain. Nick watched as the song changed again, but yet nothing changed in the sphere at first. But then the land and waters began to shift, and liquid stone rose up spewed violently across the sphere as the sphere shifted and began to rotate around the sun and the moon around the sphere. It was only then that the song ended, and Nick realized that all along the voice that was singing was his own. He then opened his eyes. 292. Chapter 292. Nick saw that he was once again in the workshop, and that Flitwick was looking over him worriedly. "Ah, how long was I out?" he asked as he sat up. He had a headache, but wasn't all that surprised about it, considering he was fairly certain he had just witnessed the birth of a world. "About 6 hours or so," the small professor said, and relaxed as he noticed that Nick was fine. Nick was better than fine, in fact, as he was not only fully restored in terms of energy, but also felt a strange pressure on his mind. Examining this pressure, he quickly found himself once again standing in the void, but unlike in his previous dream. The elements were in chaos and clashed violently against each other. Nick pulled back his examination of the pressure and stumbled for a moment in disorientation. "No need to worry, that was my doing," he reassured Flitwick with a smile. Helena had apparently been keeping the enchantment on the ring unstable this whole time and was clearly struggling with it. Nick picked his hammer up from the ground next to the anvil and didn't glow even though he channeled his energy. He then fell into a trance as he started to sing a primal and wordless song that sent shivers down Flitwick and Helena's spines. As he sang, his hammer rose and fell on the unfinished ring, sending an invisible magical shockwave from his body that every wizard in the world, past the third threshold of power, felt. They didn't know what it was, but the rhythm seemed to strike at their very souls and brought tears to their eyes, though they knew not why. Grindelwald wept freely with a wide smile and an unmistakable expression of joy. "So you have finally taken that step, it seems. I can't wait to see the world you build for myself." He spoke cryptically, much to the confusion of his subordinates nearby. Dumbledore also wept, but had a confused but calm expression. He knew what was causing this phenomenon, but didn't know how the person responsible was doing it. The Flammels also shed tears, but both had joyous expressions, as for the briefest moment that the rhythm lasted they had felt the birth of a mythical craftsman. Still, as the song of creation circled the globe, it sent quite a few wizards into a panic, since they did not know what they were experiencing, and the fear of the unknown crept up on them. The only powerful wizard who did not feel this rhythm was Voldemort in the forests of Albania. His incomplete soul and lack of a magical core, since he had no body, meant that the rhythm passed through him unseen and unfelt. The biggest phenomena, however, was that for this brief instant, every single magical beast on the planet was silent. They dared not make any noise, as the song of creation resonated with each and every one of them. Soon, Nick sang the final note of his song and struck the ring on the anvil one final time before he fell out of his trance. He didn't know why, but he instinctively knew that he needed to place greed on this new ring, which he did without hesitation. Greed sank into the large shifting ring alongside all of its contents, and the ring glowed a bright rainbow light before solidifying into a strange glowing glass-like form. Nick spoke one last time to complete this forging session, and the ring, Arda Milmi, Realm of Avarice. Ring, Arda Milmi grade. Mythical abilities. Auto-sizing, formless, devouring counterattack, fear transformation, storage, 3 cubic meters. Bound, Nicholas Ravenclaw, false world, growth mythical ability. Realm, a small pocket dimension capable of supporting life that can grow infinitely so long as it is fed enough materials. Description, a monstrous creation that was created to be a hellish defender of its owner's belongings stored within. Much like a boggart, the ring doesn't have a set form and is deceptively plain until provoked. This ring contains a false realm dimension bound to its creator that can grow infinitely. System appraisal, a complex and powerful creation that deserves a place within myth, created by an established ring. Nick's eyes bugged out when reading the system appraisal of the ring sitting on his anvil, as it was far more powerful than he had even thought. He also had a sneaking suspicion that the only reason the ring wasn't legendary grade was because it lacked a second transcendent ability, and that its current realm was only 3 meters large. "Is it done?" Flitwick asked, while looking at the strange glass-like ring on the anvil. Nick nodded and handed the half-goblin the ring, which shrank down to normal size the moment he touched it. 293. Chapter 293. The professor turned the ring over several times, but frowned as he couldn't tell anything about the enchantment at all. It was almost like he was looking at a normal piece of scenery and not a complex enchanted item. With a helpless sigh, he could only give up on his examinations, since he clearly wasn't going to learn anything about it this way. It's the oddest thing to know that something is a powerful artifact, yet unable to tell. Out of curiosity, what was that song of yours anyways? I've never heard anything like it before, he asked curiously. Song? Nick asked, confused about what he was talking about, since he fell into a trance during that period and thus didn't remember what happened. You sang a song while swinging your hammer, don't you remember? Helena asked, with a look of confusion. Nick shook his head. The only thing I remember was stepping up to the anvil and then naming the ring to finish the forging. Are you saying I sang during that time? He sought verification, and both of them nodded. He frowned at that before Celebrimber filled him in on what exactly had happened. You sang the song of creation, the music of the Aena that birthed my world so very long ago. It is truly an honor to bear witness to such a thing. The elf said with the most reverent tone Nick had ever heard from him. I don't remember any of that, I'm afraid. Nick said honestly, causing both Flitwick and Helena to look disappointed. They truly wanted to know what exactly that song had been, but if Nick himself didn't know, there was nothing to be done about it. It is not a thing to be remembered, but felt as it is the harmony of concepts rather than something physical. Celebrimber explained. Nick finally chose to turn in the mission he had gotten after the system updated now that he felt he wasn't cheating the system. This resulted in 1-item ticket, 500 galleons, and a crafting method ticket popping up in the new realm. It was weird as Nick could feel the whole realm as well as everything in it, as though it were a part of himself. No wonder they all got so angry when Morgoth corrupted the realm. It's like someone pissing on your hand. He thought seriously. Nick didn't hold back on any questions. Helena or Flitwick asked him about his new ring that sat comfortably on the ring that previously held greed. They were mostly just curious about what it did as well as what sort of benefits it had. To answer these, he directly brought them into the ring's realm. My goodness, a livable expanded space that feels just like standing outside. How wonderful. Flitwick squeaked in excitement as he waved his hand creating a small breeze that rotated around the tiny planet. So long as I continuously feed it resources, it will also grow larger as well, Nick explained proudly. Is there a limit to how large this space can get? Helena asked curiously while picking up a book that was just sitting on the ground. When greed had been integrated into this new ring, all of its contents had been haphazardly thrown about, and Nick hadn't had the time to organize them again. No, in theory, if I feed the ring enough resources, I can expand this realm infinitely. Nick answered honestly. Incredible. This is truly a masterwork deserving of praise without any doubt, Flitwick said with a massive smile. I could not have done it without both of your help. Honestly speaking, this realm only has a single issue that makes it less than perfect, Nick said with a sigh. What might that be? Flitwick asked, confused, since as far as he was concerned, this realm was perfect. It is bound to myself, so no one other than me can ever own it, even if I wanted to pass it to another, Nick said honestly. Flitwick was startled by this, but after thinking about it couldn't help but remember the drop of shining blood Nick had used to bring the ring under control during the enchanting process. Think nothing of it, my boy. This just means you now have something that everyone else can only be envious of, the professor said with a smile. Nick nodded. That's true, I suppose. But now I have the headache of trying to figure out how to grow this realm without sacrificing huge chunks of our planet to it, he said helplessly. As the owner of the realm, Nick was innately aware of what was needed to expand the realm. It was a simple process, really, as he first needed to add space somehow, then fill the extra space with air, stone, and water to expand the tiny planet. 294. Chapter 294. What do you mean? Flitwick asked curiously. The resources I need to expand the space available in this ring is space itself and the material that makes up our own world. Basically, the only way to increase the size of this realm is to feed it parts of our own, which is, as you know, is in rather limited quantities. Nick explained helplessly. Would conjured material work? Helena asked, while casting a spell that summoned a boulder from thin air. When she released it, the boulder evaporated, and yet no change occurred in the realm save a tiny uptick in mana concentration in the air. Never mind, she said awkwardly, after seeing the lack of reaction the realm had to her conjuration. I'm sure you can grow this place plenty without worrying about the earth. Just don't go sacrificing whole mountains, and I'm sure no one will even notice, Flitwick said reassuringly. Nick nodded before bringing them out of the realm and back into the workshop. Unlocking the door to the workshop, Nick was surprised to find Dumbledore waiting outside it. Tempus. Nick checked the time, but found that it was only 5:27 p.m. Good evening, Professor. Is there something you need? Nick asked, a little confused why the man was here at all. Yes, actually. Could you perhaps explain the phenomena that swept the globe earlier? Dumbledore asked with an amused expression, while Nick went 6 shades paler in an instant. Did you say the globe? Nick asked for confirmation, and the old wizard nodded while letting himself into the workshop. Oh yes, it caused quite the stir from what my sources tell me. The ministries around the globe think it's a precursor to something else, but I know differently, the headmaster said casually. Nick looked confused. A precursor to what? Grindelwald's insanity, he questioned out loud. I can assure you that Gellert is anything but insane, though I am curious as to why you seem aware of what he plans to do, Dumbledore said with a look of interest as he sat down in one of the chairs Nick had moved into the workshop for his friends. I may have read a tome or two on the topic of rituals in my free time, and the sacrifices didn't make much sense if that was how he restored his youth. Add on his binding oath, and it's pretty clear he has something really big planned that is probably not a good thing, Nick said honestly. Dumbledore chuckled. Yes, that is a fairly good deduction of the situation, thought. I am certain I had all the tomes on rituals within the library moved the forbidden section, he said with an amused look. There are more sources of information than just the library at my fingertips, you know, Nick said, dodging that verbal pitfall easily. I suppose that is true. We've gotten a bit off topic, however, the old goat said, not pressuring Nick at all on the topic of his forbidden knowledge. Nick shrugged. I don't remember that particular time frame, unfortunately, but these two can probably explain it a little better than I could since they do, he explained while pointing at Flitwick and Helena. Dumbledore seemed surprised, but after listening to the other's account of the situation, had an understanding look on his face. A magical epiphany, quite the rare event even for master crafters, but one valuable enough that many would be willing to sacrifice much to experience it themselves. I am a bit envious, to be honest, as I myself have only experienced such a thing 3 times in all my experiences, the old man said with a smile. Why have I never heard of something like that until now? Nick asked with a frown. In this case, I'm afraid you are a victim of your own success. Should you have learned crafting in the traditional manner, you would likely be well aware of this information, as it is an open secret amongst crafters like us. By creating your own methods, however, you lack the knowledge of the traditional crafters, and as such weren't aware of such a thing until now. Dumbledore explained helpfully, and Nick grimaced, since the old goat was probably right. His knowledge of crafting was based on the information within Celebrimber's inheritance, and as such only included what he deemed important to the craft. The fact the elf himself had also not mentioned this topic, at least once, meant he was probably unfamiliar with it as well. Perhaps it is a phenomena unique to this world's magical energy, Nick wondered to himself. With that answered, I find myself curious as to what you created during that event. Dumbledore said, with a curious gaze at the glowing glass-like ring on Nick's hand. 295. Chapter 295. Nick basically gave the old goat the same tour of the realm that Helena and Flitwick got, while also explaining how he could expand the size of it, as well as its bound nature. In the end, Dumbledore surprisingly offered to support the expansion of the realm, since as an alchemist, he could make spatial items fairly easily, and buying large amounts of stone is something people have been doing for centuries, and is also fairly inexpensive for a wizard. Nick explained that while the spatial items would be appreciated, the stone he could get himself. The old goat was more than willing to accept that answer, and even explained that he was only offering it to begin with because he was fascinated by the sheer potential the realm had. According to him, it was a rare and valuable opportunity that he had no intention of missing. After that, everyone went to dinner after getting into a deep conversation on crafting, since every one of them had a unique viewpoint on the topic to add. Helena had the stuff from the founder's time, Dumbledore his knowledge of transfiguration and alchemy, while Flitwick was a master enchanter himself. It was a fruitful conversation for everyone involved, with even masters like Flitwick and Dumbledore getting valuable insights that they had never even considered before. Though had the biggest takeaway, though, as he was the most inexperienced amongst all of them. When they all entered the great hall together, chatting away, many gave them surprised looks. Nick sat at the Gryffindor table and was preparing to dig in when Hermione spoke up. "What have you even been doing this whole time? You never returned to the common room at all," she questioned sternly. Nick flashed his new ring. "I was busy making this with Helena and Professor Flitwick," he said honestly. "Bloody hell." "For 2 whole days," Ron exclaimed, and Nick shook his head. "Obviously, we took a few breaks, but for the most part it was near constant work for at least one of us," he said seriously. "Must be a mighty valuable piece of jewelry if that's the case." Seamus butted in while looking at the ring in question curiously. "Oh yeah, only one that I'll ever make because of what it does," Nick said honestly. "What's it do?" the twins asked at the same time, very interested. "The same thing as the ring it replaced, but like a billion times better. Not only does it let me store things in it, but I can also keep living things within it like plants or animals. I can also make the size of the storage infinitely larger so long as I feed the ring enough materials," Nick explained with a grin. Everyone listening to him was left dumbfounded. "Does that mean you could eventually have an entire planet all to yourself?" Dean Thomas asked with a doubtful expression. Nick nodded. "Yeah, if I give the ring a planet's worth of resources," he said honestly. "That's nuts," Dean exclaimed in shock. "There's also no point in stealing it either, since it's bound to me exclusively. Even if I died, it wouldn't work for anyone else. I won't ever make another one, so it'll be a priceless artifact forever," Nick said with a grin. A few people complained about how they really wanted a world to themselves too, but it was mostly joking. The ring continued being a topic of conversation for the rest of the night, as Nick happily gave tour of his realm. He didn't do this for free, though, but rather traded for whatever the others had to give. Money, knickknacks, potions, you name it, and he accepted it all since, after sacrificing it to the ring, made his realm more and more perfect. Magical things, for example, broke down into mana and base elements that were fused into his mini-planet of his realm. Interestingly, this extra mana didn't dissipate back into the real world, but stayed in the realm and increased the concentration of mana in the air. He cheated a bit once he found that out, and took a trip into the realm to purge out most of his mana into the air, which caused the concentration to rise greatly. Once he re-entered the real world, he passively refilled his stores, using the ambient mana, which made him smile widely. He figured that if he sacrificed all of his leftover mana at the end of the day, his realm would likely become super saturated by the energy, eventually so long as he didn't expand the space too fast. Once he had the time, though, he carefully reorganized all of his stuff in the realm as well, since it was a mess. 296. Chapter 296. Dumbledore was not joking about his support in expanding the realm at all, as over the next few days, he gave Nick no less than 30 miles worth of expanded space items that were feed to the ring, dramatically increasing the amount of room the planet had to fit in. The headmaster loved sitting inside the realm and casting spells that struck the edge of the realm before sacrificing a spatial item, and then checking the distance improvement again. The old goat wasn't alone in this either, as despite Nick's insistence that he could afford to get the stone himself, Flitwick had purchased a large hill's worth of mixed soil just for this purpose. Helpless Nick could only indulge the two older wizards and watch the planet double in size. After the third day, though, things got busy for everyone, as something came out of nowhere, ruining the peaceful school year. Harry woke up screaming at midnight on the night of November 15, having received a vision of someone in black robes and a skull mask sacrificing nearly 20 people to repair the decrepit body of Voldemort. Nick, Harry, and Ron immediately broke curfew to seek out Dumbledore. The old man had a grave expression after hearing the tale from Harry. "Are you certain about what it was you saw?" he questioned severely. Harry still had a horrified expression as he nodded, and despite noticing the old goat using legilimency on Harry, Nick said nothing because of the perspective of the vision Harry received. Voldemort had turned Nagini into a Horcrux 2 whole years early, and also had someone serving him when all his followers should be either locked up or ignoring him. Nick thought, concerned. This was a massive change from the events of canon and made Nick very worried. Voldemort's early return spelt serious trouble for the future, because not only was the madman aware that Nick had destroyed one of his Horcruxes, but he was also likely to start checking the rest of them as well. Considering Voldemort would definitely hide the ring once he noticed that all but that one had been destroyed, Nick guessed he had at most 3 days to get rid of the thing as well as retrieve the resurrection stone. "Harry, Ron, you go ahead and head back to the dorm. I need to talk to Professor Dumbledore alone first," Nick said seriously, and Harry looked to the headmaster, who nodded with a smile before both boys left. Nick knew that what he was about to say was going to open a huge can of worms, but he was pressed for time, and Dumbledore was the only person who could help him. The moment he was sure that Harry was gone, Nick spilt the beans about Voldemort's Horcruxes, about how he had been hunting them down, about how Nazgul had turned into an actual creature by eating the soul shards, everything he knew about the Dark Lord. At first, Dumbledore was in disbelief, then anger, and finally acceptance. "I won't lecture you about how serious this matter is, since it's clear to me that you are well aware. Know, however, that I very much disapprove of you keeping this information to yourself, and even the actions you have taken knowing it. Right now, however, as you have said, we have a more pressing concern in the form of the last inanimate Horcrux. You say you have tracked it down, but have not had the time to collect and destroy it yet, correct?" Dumbledore says sternly. Nick nodded. "It's located inside the residence of the Gaunt clan, which is a shack in Little Hangleton," he said seriously. "Don't try and go to that place without me, as not only do you lack the means to destroy the cursed thing while I have it, but the things have a way to ensnare the spirit, which doesn't work on me," Nick added, shutting that thought down before Dumbledore could even have it. The old goat stared at Nick sternly. "I cannot in good conscience allow you to continue to act against Voldemort in such a reckless manner," he said firmly. Nick snorted and immediately started pulling out the ex-Horcruxes from his realm, the diadem, the locket, and the goblet. "I am already inextricably involved in this matter and refuse to stop until that man is gone for good. Will you help me, or must I take drastic measures to get it done?" Nick said, staring the man straight in the eyes. The two locked gazes for an entire minute without backing down, as the very air felt stifling as their magic pressured and clashed against the others. Eventually, Dumbledore relented. "So be it, but you must follow my orders without hesitation, understood?" he said, and Nick nodded in agreement. 297. Chapter 297. Nick returned to the dorm room after that, while Dumbledore said he needed to prepare for the trip. Harry and Ron grilled Nick when he got back to the dorm about what he talked with Dumbledore about. Nick chose to trust them and told the truth about the matter, and they got mad at him for keeping it from them. "It didn't have anything to do with either of you until now, so there was no reason why I should have told any of you." Nick defended himself. "Besides, what good would it have done, huh? None of you could help at all and would have just been in danger instead," he added angrily. How could he not be mad when they didn't care about their own safety and even had the nerve to say he was wrong to keep it to himself? His words stung at his friends, and they couldn't help but look hurt. They wanted nothing more to help him, but he flat out told them that they would be nothing but a burden instead. It stung and made them feel like bad friends as Nick stormed out of the dorm as well as the common room. Half of Gryffindor heard them and woke up from the commotion. Nick went straight to the room of requirement and vented his anger on some defenseless targets. Shattered and burnt wood littered the room within the hour as he violently attacked the dummies with his elemental abilities. "Huff, huff, huff," again, he yelled while out of breath, but the room no longer reset itself. Nick was confused at this until Helena spoke up from behind him. "You know, when Mother made this room, she added a special rule that we could always enter it regardless of what the person currently occupying it wanted," she said calmly. "What do you want?" Nick asked venomously as his anger got the best of him. Helena merely chuckled at that. "I was angry and bitter for hundreds of years. Having someone else get angry at me is nothing," she said, and Nick snorted and turned to leave since she had decided to play the part of therapist. He didn't need nor want it, and refused to accept it, but the door of the room vanished entirely. He growled in frustration at that, and raised his wand at the wall. "Bombarder," he shouted, and a wave of concussive force flew from the tip of his wand into the blank wall. He wasn't angry in the same way as when Lockhart attacked him, or when Dumbledore stole his blood to get his heritage revealed. This time it was more frustration than anything else, and thus he hadn't accidentally created bad weather or released his magical energy haphazardly. The thing about frustration is that it can be a tricky thing to get rid of permanently, like it can get buried for a long time before something triggers it, and it erupts like a volcano. That was the state Nick was in at this moment, and so his mind wasn't very clear when he decided that, since the wall stood in his way, it deserved to be destroyed. Nick had felt the pressure of Zeus and the recovery of the earth weighing down on him. Voldemort returning early was the last straw that broke the camel's back and caused him to snap. The force from the spell didn't destroy the wall, though, as the room's wards sprang up and blocked the attack entirely. He was stumped by this enough to regain his sanity and clarity of mind. "Feeling better," Helena teased, and Nick looked embarrassed, since he must have looked like an angsty child to her. This wasn't to say that he was suddenly happy or anything, merely that he could at least rationally think about why he was upset now. "Is it so wrong that I kept all this stuff from them?" he asked, slightly lost. Helena shook her head. "It's not wrong at all, but that doesn't mean it didn't hurt to get told that they were basically dead weight. In time I'm sure they will understand, but for now you all will need time to settle," she said honestly. Nick sighed. "You're probably right, but man, if it isn't irritating," he complained. She let him leave the room after that, and Nick spent the night in the workshop with Nazgul, Dusk, and Steve all nearby, or literally on top of him in Steve's case. The next morning, he ate breakfast in his workshop before Dumbledore arrived to head out and retrieve the ring from its hiding place. The man looked exhausted when he arrived outside the workshop, but considering the pressure he was under, it wasn't all that surprising. 298. Chapter 298. "Need a moment to collect yourself?" Nick asked with a raised eyebrow. "This is a simple extraction and destruction mission, not a battle to the death, so I'll be fine," the old man said reassuringly. Nick looked like he didn't believe him, but chose not to mention it any longer as he sent Nazgul into his ring. "Apparition is forbidden in Hogwarts, so are we going to Hogsmeade first, or is Fawkes taking us?" Nick asked calmly. Dumbledore seemed surprised by the question, but quickly recovered. "It's best we go to Hogsmeade first," he answered, and Nick nodded. They left the castle after that and took a carriage to the small wizarding town near the castle. It was a quaint little place with various shops that were clearly only there to profit off the students of the school that regularly frequent the town. Each shop was less business and more personal, which made sense considering most of them were family-owned and operated. Other than the shops, there was the Shrieking Shack at the top of the hill on the far side of the town, as well as various homes dotted about the place in the strange, haphazard manner wizards were fond of for some reason. Nick noticed the slightly conflicted look Dumbledore gave the seediest pub in the town known as the Hog's Head Pub. Knowing that the place was run by the man's brother Aberforth Dumbledore, he chose to leave the matter alone. Nick may not like Dumbledore all that much, but that didn't mean he was going to purposefully dig at his old wounds for no reason. The death of his sister Ariana, and thus the resulting falling out between the two brothers, was an extremely sore subject to the old man, and Nick knew it. "Take hold of my arm so that we may be off." Dumbledore spoke firmly, and Nick did as he was told, as he had agreed to. As always, apparition was a dreadful thing to experience that felt like getting sucked through a straw gut first. Nick felt the magic with his magical sense, but like before he couldn't make heads or tails of it as the spatial interference warped the feedback he received. The next moment they arrived in Little Hangleton, which was a sleepy place with an almost equal mix of wizards and muggles. Despite the large amount of wizards, the whole place was well covered in wards to prevent the muggles from paying too much attention to their unusual neighbors. Nick and Dumbledore arrived in an alley with a semi-loud pop that apparition was well known for. Nick shuddered for a moment as he fought to settle his stomach from the nausea that he felt after the translocation. Dumbledore seemed amused about this, but remained stoic as he led Nick eastward to the dark and run-down building hidden behind the trees. Nick couldn't help but notice the obscene amount of magical energy that tainted the place from the long-term occupation of a wizarding family there. The ambient mana was seemingly permanently stained with the residual traces of the Slytherin bloodline that drew many snakes to the area instinctively. The serpents avoid the two strangers on this land, however, as both felt dangerous. Soon the two of them arrived outside the building that still bore faint reminders of the long, lost glory of its previous occupants, yet was now merely a ruined and cursed place. That last part was meant very literally, as Voldemort had placed several dark enchantments in and around the building to protect his treasure. "Step lightly. This place is full of dark magic, and not just the one we are after," Nick said seriously, and Dumbledore nodded as all signs of fatigue vanished from him once the adrenaline started coursing through his veins. Both pulled out their wands before moving forward with determination in their eyes. Each of them covered the other as they disarmed each trap carefully and with precision. Together, they made fast progress into the building and towards the living room that Nick felt the unmistakable magic of a Horcrux in. The defenses placed in this part of the shack were the firmest and slowed down the duo considerably, as they needed to be very careful in dismantling them. The traps were intricately linked to prevent one from tampering with them one piece at a time, which meant the whole thing needed to be done at the same time. Still, they got through the cursed defenses and reached the place that hid the Horcrux. "It's here, under the floorboards," Nick said seriously, and Dumbledore flicked the Elder Wand, sending the boards up and out of the way. There in the dust and dirt sat a small box tightly covered in curses and deadly traps. 299. Chapter 299. Dumbledore and Nick went to work disarming the various curses and traps on the box. It took them quite some time to finally go through the defenses and open the box to reveal the single strange-looking ring within it. It was a thin golden band with a stone set on top of it that definitely didn't fit it, as it was smooth, round-shaped and nearly 2.5 centimeters long. On the surface of the plain-looking grey stone was the symbol of the Deathly Hallows, a triangle within a circle that had a line going down the middle of it. Nick noticed Dumbledore's breathing change drastically when he saw this symbol, and a temptation to put the ring on came from the soul shard within the metal. Nick definitely noticed that the stone itself was entirely unconnected to the Horcrux, magically speaking. Before Dumbledore could reach out with his hand, Nick waved his wand through the spiritual coercion of the soul shard, snapping Dumbledore out of it. You almost fell victim to the shard's influence, but lucky for you I can directly counter it, Nick said, and the old man had a horrified look. He himself was more than a little aware of just how close to falling for the temptation he had gotten, and as such knew that Nick wasn't exaggerating at all. Let's quickly remove the curse from this ring so I can destroy the soul shard, Nick added, and Dumbledore nodded. Unlike the other defenses around the ring, the curse on the ring was well hidden and didn't have a counter curse to it. That was where Nick came in and removed it by hitting it with a few pulses of exactly opposite magical energy frequencies. Once the Horcrux was totally curse-free, Nazgul was pulled out to do her job. She immediately locked her gaze on the ring the moment she left the ring realm, as she had vague recollections of eating similar things. She immediately swiped out with her serpentine head and dragged the soul shard screaming out of the ring. Dumbledore felt goosebumps rise all over his body at this and watched stiffly as the no longer cute monster snapped up the soul shard with relish. If you don't mind, I'll add this ring to my collection since it's totally safe now, Nick said while grabbing the ex-Horcrux and tossing it into his realm without hesitation. Dumbledore only then snapped out of his head and realized that Nick had just taken the last of the 3 Hallows. He frowned as he realized that Nick definitely knew what the stone setting was with how eager he was to store it away. "How did you learn of the Hallows?" he asked while backing away from Nick with his wand raised. "Oh, that. Quite some time now. My first run-in with them, however, was when you sent Harry his cloak last Christmas," Nick said casually. "Then you should know the fate that their owners all befell," Dumbledore said sternly. Nick laughed at that. "If you are referring to the terrible deaths their wielders experienced, then you have nothing to worry about on my regard. I don't intend to hold on to the stone for very long after all," he said with a smile. This left Dumbledore confused, since he couldn't understand why someone like Nick would give up such a thing. Nick saw his confusion and chose to explain himself, since the old man deserved at least that much in his opinion. "While the tales of Beedle, the bard, says that the Hallows were made by death, we both know that this was not true exactly. In truth, the creators of the Hallows were the 3 brothers who instead probably learned from the entity in question instead. It goes to reason, then, that those same brothers likely placed an impossible-to-detect bloodline curse in the magic of each Hallow, so that only a Peveril could use them safely. This explains why the descendants of the 3 brothers tended to live fairly long lives in the case of the descendants of Cadmus, the Gaunts, and Ignatius, the Potters. I have no use for the stone, but my good friend, who just so happens to be the last descendant of Ignatius and current owner of the cloak Hallow might," Nick said, explained calmly. "Oh, and I suggest you find a way to pass that wand to him as well, since it's already plotting your death most likely," Nick added before walking past the stunned man, with Nazgul following along contented after a good meal. 300. Chapter 300. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing, either on Nick's part, as he had long been aware of the fact he would come into possession of the Resurrection Stone, and thus had been planning what to do with it for quite some time. While the stone was quite the useful item in that it let you summon the spirits of the dead, there was a catch that made it nearly useless to Nick. See, the stone had a limitation in that it could only summon those who were personally known by the person using it. The reason this was useless to Nick was that he couldn't summon, say, the soul of Kronos or Merlin in order to learn from them. That limitation meant that besides torturing himself by summoning the soul of a friend or family member, the stone held no value. Besides that, Nick was a firm believer that the dead have no place in the land of the living, and the description of the torment the souls brought by the stone felt proved it. Even when angry, Nick was never one to purposefully torment others in any meaningful way. In the hands of someone ancient, such as Nicholas Flamel, on the other hand, the stone was a source of old and forgotten knowledge, since the man could summon the souls of people from throughout his long life and copy down their knowledge. Still, Nick knew that the stone would only show its best in the hands of a member of the Peveril bloodline. Speaking of uses, Nick was currently analyzing the stone using his realm and was not surprised at what he was discovering. The stone itself was actually just a normal rock, like the sort one might pick up from the road. The person who made it into what it is currently, however, was a masterful enchanter, as each grain of the stones was positively covered in tiny complex runes that served as a part of the whole. Nick was fairly certain that if he studied the cloak as well in his realm, he would discover a similar thing. The Hallows weren't created by Hades, but it was clear that he had given the three brothers their inspiration and possibly even taught them via his projection. Why he would do something like this was beyond Nick's understanding and would likely only be answered in the future when he met the guard in person, assuming he survived that long, of course. It didn't take long for Dumbledore to find Nick after he left the old man to his thoughts and apparate them back to Hogsmeade without a word. Clearly, the man was still caught up in his thoughts, as he simply left Nick in the village before apparating away again. Nick merely shrugged at this and chose to treat the day as an unofficial holiday for himself before having letting out Nazgul from the Ring Realm. The two of them then made their way over to Honeyduke's candy shop to check for new or interesting treats. The owner of the sweet shop at the moment was Ambrosius Flume, and his wife, who both didn't ask Nick a single question about why he was there during the week, since he spent close to 7 galleons on various sweets. He got some chocolate frogs, every flavor beans, lemon drops, and even a blood-flavored lollipop that was apparently an experimental product of theirs. Nick helpfully tried the scarlet candy while in the store and admitted that minus the sweetness, it did indeed taste like blood. He even added that if they added a touch of cinnamon to the lollipop, it might prove fairly popular. Mr. Flume was grateful for the input and wished Nick well as he left the shop still sucking on the sucker for no reason other than he hated wasting food. He offered it to Nazgul, but she smelt the bloody smell of it and literally turned her nose up at it. Helpless, he could only eat it himself as he stopped by Scrivenshafts to collect some more ink and parchment for Hermione and Daphne, who went through the stuff very quickly with their rune practice. While he was there, he also grabbed another engraving pen, since it was also starting to wear down from all the sharpenings it's gotten. After that, he moved over to the Three Broomsticks Inn to indulge himself in a bit of butter beer that was honestly closer to butterscotch soda than any proper alcohol. It was horribly sweet and had a very low alcohol content, meaning it was damn near impossible to actually get drunk off it. The owner of the inn, Madame Rosmutter, questioned Nick on why he was there during the week, but Nick explained how he was left here by Dumbledore, which plenty of people saw.